Throughout history, certain objects have been linked to unexplained tragedies and mysterious deaths. These artifacts, now housed in museums and private collections around the world, share disturbing patterns that have puzzled researchers for decades. These events, from ancient Egyptian relics to medieval weapons, from precious gemstones to historical paintings, raised more questions as the investigations got deeper. Are these simply cases of bad luck, or is there something more we don't understand? This is not a collection of ghost stories. This is a serious look at real events, real people, and real objects that continue to raise questions about the world around us. And you'll decide what to believe based on the evidence we present. The Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond, a stunning 45.52 carat blue gemstone now housed in the Smithsonian Institution, has earned its reputation as one of the most cursed objects in human history through a documented trail of financial ruin, mysterious deaths, and personal tragedies that have followed its owners for over 3 centuries. The diamond story begins in 1666, when French gem merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier acquired the massive 112-carat rough blue diamond from the Kollur mine in the Golconda region of India. According to some accounts, Tavernier purchased the stone legitimately from Indian merchants, while other versions suggest he may have stolen it from the eye of a Hindu statue in a temple dedicated to the goddess Sita. Regardless of how he obtained it, Tavernier's acquisition of this sacred blue stone marked the beginning of a pattern of misfortune that would follow the diamond across continents and through generations of owners. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier was an experienced traveller and gem trader who had made 6 successful voyages to India and the Ottoman Empire, building a fortune through his ability to acquire rare and valuable gemstones for European royalty. He was known for his careful documentation of his travels and his honest dealing with both suppliers and customers. However, after acquiring the blue diamond that would later become the Hope Diamond, Tavernier's fortunes began to change dramatically. His 7th and final voyage to India in 1668 proved to be a financial disaster, with several of his major gem purchases turning out to be of poor quality or fraudulent. More significantly, Tavernier's personal life began to unravel as family members experienced a series of tragedies and health problems that coincided with his possession of the blue diamond. In 1668, Tavernier sold the massive blue diamond to King Louis XIV of France for the enormous sum of 220,000 livres, equivalent to several $1 million in today's currency. The transaction appeared to restore Tavernier's financial position, but the relief was temporary. Within months of the sale, Tavernier began experiencing a series of setbacks that would ultimately destroy his wealth and reputation. Business ventures that had previously been successful began failing, partnerships dissolved in acrimony, and Tavernier found himself facing lawsuits and financial claims that ate away at his newly acquired fortune. Most troubling were the health problems that began affecting his family members, including the sudden death of his adult son under circumstances that contemporary physicians could not explain. King Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, commissioned the court jeweller to recut the massive blue diamond, reducing it from 112 carats to approximately 69 carats, and renaming it Le Bleu de France, or the French Blue. The stone became the centerpiece of the French crown jewels and was incorporated into various ceremonial objects and jewelry pieces over the following decades. Louis XIV himself seemed initially immune to any curse effects, enjoying a long and successful reign that lasted 72 years. However, the king's later years were marked by a series of personal tragedies and military defeats that some courtiers whispered were connected to his possession of the cursed blue diamond. His son, the Grand Dauphin, died unexpectedly in 1711, followed by the death of his grandson in 1712, leaving his great-grandson as heir to the throne. The French blue passed to Louis XV and then to Louis XVI, who inherited the stone along with the rest of the crown jewels when he became king in 1774. Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were known to favour the spectacular blue diamond, with Marie Antoinette frequently wearing jewellery containing the stone at court functions and public appearances. However, their ownership of the diamond coincided with the period of greatest crisis in French royal history. The financial difficulties that had been building throughout the 18th century reached a critical point during Louis XVI's reign, leading to widespread social unrest and eventually to the French Revolution that would cost both the king and queen their lives. The tragic fate of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette has often been cited as the most dramatic example of the Hope Diamond's curse in action. Both monarchs were executed by guillotine during the Reign of Terror, with Louis XVI dying in January 1793 and Marie-Antoinette following him to the scaffold in October of the same year. Their deaths marked the end of over 1,000 years of French monarchy and represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in European history. While political and economic factors clearly played the primary role in their downfall, the timing of their possession of the cursed blue diamond has not been lost on those who believe in the stone's malevolent power. During the chaos of the French Revolution, the French blue was stolen in September 1792, when revolutionaries broke into the royal treasury and looted the crown jewels. The theft occurred during a week-long period of systematic pillaging that saw many of France's most valuable royal artifacts disappear forever. The French blue vanished completely during this period, and its whereabouts remained unknown for over 20 years. However, the thieves who stole the diamond did not escape the curse's influence. Historical records indicate that several of the men involved in the crown jewel theft met violent ends during the continued turmoil of the revolutionary period, with some dying in the very same prison where Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette had been held before their executions. The diamond reappeared in London around 1812, when it surfaced in the possession of diamond merchant Daniel Eliasson. The stone had been recut again, this time down to approximately 45 carats, giving it the shape and size it maintains today. However, the exact circumstances of how Eliasson acquired the diamond remain mysterious, and his ownership was brief and troubled. Eliasson experienced significant financial difficulties during his possession of the stone and was eager to sell it to recover his losses. The diamond's reputation for bringing misfortune was already beginning to circulate in London's gem trading community, making it difficult for Eliasson to find buyers willing to take the risk of owning the cursed stone. The diamond was eventually purchased by London banker Thomas Hope around 1824, giving the stone the name by which it is known today. Hope was a wealthy and influential member of London society who collected art and precious objects as both investments and symbols of his cultural sophistication. He acquired the blue diamond for an estimated $65,000 to $90,000, an enormous sum that reflected both the stone's rarity and beauty. However, Hope's ownership of the diamond was relatively brief, as he died in 1831, just 7 years after acquiring it. While Hope's death was attributed to natural causes related to his advanced age, his possession of the diamond had coincided with a period of declining health and increasing financial pressures that forced him to consider selling portions of his art collection. After Thomas Hope's death, the diamond became the subject of a lengthy legal dispute among his heirs that took over a decade to resolve. The stone finally passed to his nephew, Henry Thomas Hope, in 1841, but the family's troubles with the diamond were far from over. Henry Thomas Hope's ownership of the diamond was marked by a series of personal and financial setbacks that gradually eroded the family's wealth and social standing. His marriage proved unhappy and unstable, his business ventures failed consistently, and he found himself forced to sell other valuable family assets to maintain his lifestyle. The Hope family's problems with the diamond continued into the next generation. Henry Thomas Hope's son, Lord Francis Hope, inherited the stone but faced even more severe financial difficulties than his father had experienced. Lord Francis was forced to sell the family's country estate and other valuable properties to pay his debts, but these measures proved insufficient to solve his financial problems. In 1901, Lord Francis received permission from the courts to sell the Hope diamond despite objections from other family members who wanted to keep the historic gem in the family collection. The sale was necessitated by mounting debts that threatened to bankrupt the entire Hope estate. The diamond was purchased by New York gem dealer Joseph Frankel and Sons in 1901, but their ownership proved to be brief and unprofitable. The gem trading firm experienced a series of business failures and legal problems during their possession of the diamond, ultimately forcing them to sell it to recoup their losses. The stone changed hands several more times during the first decade of the 20th century, with each successive owner experiencing similar patterns of financial difficulties and personal misfortunes that seemed to follow possession of the cursed blue diamond. In 1910, the Hope diamond was acquired by Pierre Cartier, the famous French jeweller who recognized both the stone's exceptional beauty and its notorious reputation. Cartier was a skilled businessman who understood that the diamond's curse legend could actually enhance its value by making it more mysterious and desirable to certain types of collectors. He began actively promoting the curse stories as part of his marketing strategy, embellishing and expanding the tales of previous owners' misfortunes to create a more compelling narrative for potential buyers. Cartier's approach proved successful when he found a buyer who was not only wealthy enough to afford the diamond, but also intrigued rather than deterred by its dark reputation. On January 28, 1911, Pierre Cartier sold the Hope Diamond to Evelyn Walsh McLean, a wealthy American socialite who was the daughter of a Colorado mining fortune and married to the heir of the Washington Post newspaper empire. McLean paid $180,000 for the diamond, a price that reflected both its intrinsic value and the premium associated with its notorious history. McLean was known for her bold personality and her disdain for superstitions, famously declaring that she would rather own a cursed diamond than a boring one. She believed that her strong personality and good fortune would protect her from any supernatural influences associated with the stone. However, Evelyn Walsh McLean's ownership of the Hope Diamond coincided with a devastating series of personal tragedies that seemed to fulfill the darkest predictions of the curse. In 1919, her 9-year-old son Vincent was killed in a car accident outside the family's estate, struck by a vehicle while playing near the road. The death of her child was a devastating blow that McLean never fully recovered from, and she began to show signs of the depression and erratic behaviour that would plague her for the rest of her life. Her husband, Edward Ned McLean, also began experiencing serious problems, developing alcoholism and mental health issues that eventually required his commitment to a psychiatric institution. The McLean family's troubles continued to escalate throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Evelyn's daughter, also named Evelyn, died of a drug overdose in 1946 at the age of 25, adding another tragic loss to the family's growing list of misfortunes. Ned McLean's mental condition continued to deteriorate, and he spent his final years in psychiatric care, unable to recognise his family members or care for himself. The couple's marriage ended in divorce in 1932, with Evelyn retaining custody of the Hope Diamond, but inheriting a legacy of debt and family dysfunction that she struggled to manage. Despite the accumulating tragedies in her personal life, Evelyn Walsh McLean refused to believe that the Hope Diamond was responsible for her family's misfortunes. She continued to wear the stone regularly, and even incorporated it into her entertaining, sometimes allowing dinner guests to handle the famous diamond as a conversation piece. McLean's defiant attitude toward the curse became part of her public persona, and she often joked about the supposed supernatural dangers of owning the stone. However, friends and family members noticed that her behaviour became increasingly erratic and paranoid as the years passed, leading some to wonder if the constant stress of owning a supposedly cursed object was taking a psychological toll. Evelyn Walsh McLean died in 1947 at the age of 60, and her estate faced the immediate problem of settling massive debts that had accumulated during her final years. The Hope Diamond was sold along with other assets to satisfy creditors, bringing an end to 36 years of McLean family ownership that had been marked by an extraordinary concentration of personal tragedies and financial difficulties. The diamond was purchased by Harry Winston, a prominent New York jeweller who was known for his collection of exceptional gemstones and his ability to manage high-profile acquisitions. Harry Winston's ownership of the Hope Diamond marked a significant departure from the pattern of tragedy that had followed previous owners. Winston was a pragmatic businessman who treated the diamond primarily as a valuable asset rather than a mystical object, and he experienced none of the dramatic misfortunes that had plagued earlier owners. Winston used the Hope Diamond as a centerpiece for travelling exhibitions that showcased exceptional gemstones, allowing millions of people to view the famous stone while maintaining its commercial value. His successful management of the diamond began to change public perception of the curse, suggesting that proper handling and rational attitudes might neutralize whatever supernatural influences had previously affected owners. In 1958, Harry Winston made the decision to donate the Hope Diamond to the Smithsonian Institution, where it would be permanently displayed as part of the National Museum of Natural History's gem collection. Winston arranged for the diamond to be sent through the US mail in a plain brown paper package, a deliberately low-key approach that contrasted sharply with the dramatic stories that had surrounded the stone for centuries. The diamond arrived safely at the museum and has remained there ever since, becoming one of the most popular exhibits and attracting millions of visitors who come to see the famous cursed gem. The Hope Diamond's residence at the Smithsonian has been remarkably peaceful compared to its turbulent history in private hands. Museum staff members who work with the diamond collection have reported no unusual incidents or health problems associated with the stone, and the institution has experienced no major disasters or setbacks that could be attributed to housing the supposedly cursed gem. Scientific analysis of the diamond has revealed that its distinctive blue colour comes from trace amounts of boron in the crystal structure, and researchers have found no unusual properties that would explain the supernatural phenomena reported by previous owners. Gemologists and historians have suggested that the Hope Diamond's curse may be largely the product of coincidence, selective reporting, and the power of suggestion rather than genuine supernatural forces. Statistical analysis shows that the misfortunes experienced by the diamond's owners, while dramatic, are not necessarily more frequent or severe than those experienced by other wealthy individuals of similar social standing during the same historical periods. The concentration of tragic stories around the diamond may reflect the human tendency to notice and remember dramatic events while overlooking periods of normal or positive experiences. The Crying Boy paintings. In the early morning hours of September 4th, 1985, the Amos family home in South Yorkshire, England, was completely destroyed by a house fire that left everything inside reduced to ash and charred debris. However, when firefighters sifted through the smoking ruins, they made a discovery that would launch one of Britain's most enduring urban legends and spark a media frenzy that lasted for months. Among the devastation, they found a single item that had survived the blaze completely intact, a mass-produced print of a painting known as The Crying Boy, showing the portrait of a young child with tears streaming down his face. The painting's glass was not even cracked, its frame showed no signs of heat damage, and the image itself appeared as pristine as if it had never been exposed to the inferno that had consumed everything else in the house. The mysterious survival of this particular painting might have remained a local curiosity, if not for the fact that Yorkshire firefighter Peter Hall had been noticing a disturbing pattern during his years of service with the fire brigade. Hall had responded to dozens of house fires throughout northern England, and in case after case he had observed the same inexplicable phenomenon. Homes completely destroyed by fire, with every possession reduced to ashes, except for undamaged copies of the Crying Boy painting. The consistency of this occurrence had begun to trouble Hall and his colleagues, who started informally tracking instances where these particular prints had survived fires that destroyed everything around them. When Peter Hall learned about the Amos family fire and the survival of yet another Crying Boy painting, he decided to contact the Sun newspaper, one of Britain's most popular tabloids, known for its sensational coverage of unusual stories. Hall's account of the pattern he had observed was published in The Sun on September the 4th, 1985, under a headline that immediately captured public attention. The article described how fire brigades across northern England had repeatedly found intact Crying Boy paintings in the ruins of houses where everything else had been completely destroyed by flames. Hall was quoted as saying that he and his fellow firefighters had begun to view these paintings with suspicion, wondering if there was some connection between their presence and the devastating fires that had consumed the homes where they were displayed. The Crying Boy paintings were mass-produced prints based on original works by Bruno Amadio, an Italian artist who worked under the professional name Giovanni Bragolin. Amadio had created a series of paintings depicting children with sorrowful expressions and tears on their faces during the 1950s and 1960s. These emotionally powerful images were reproduced as inexpensive prints and sold throughout Europe, becoming particularly popular in Britain during the 1970s and early 1980s. The prints were commonly found in working-class homes, sold through door-to-door salesmen, discount stores and mail-order catalogues as affordable artwork that could add a touch of culture to modest living spaces. Bruno Amadio himself had led a somewhat mysterious life, with various conflicting accounts of his background and artistic training. Some sources described him as a Spanish painter who had moved to Italy, while others claimed he was Italian-born but had worked extensively in Spain. What was consistently documented was his specialization in paintings of children, particularly those with melancholy or sorrowful expressions. Amadio produced hundreds of paintings featuring crying children of various ages and ethnicities, creating a distinctive style that emphasized emotional vulnerability and innocence lost. His work tapped into deep psychological responses to images of childhood distress, making his paintings both popular and somewhat unsettling to viewers. Following the Sun's initial article about the fire curse, the newspaper was flooded with letters and phone calls from readers who claimed to have experienced their own supernatural encounters with crying boy paintings. Dozens of people reported house fires, electrical problems, and other domestic disasters that they attributed to their ownership of these particular prints. The stories shared remarkable similarities. Homes would experience unexplained fires, often starting in rooms where the crying boy paintings were displayed, yet the paintings themselves would survive completely undamaged while everything around them was destroyed. One particularly dramatic account came from the Hall family of Sheffield, no relation to firefighter Peter Hall, who reported that their house had caught fire 3 separate times over a period of 2 years, with each blaze starting near their crying boy painting. In each case, the painting had survived without any damage, while furniture, clothing, and other possessions in the same room had been destroyed. After the 3rd fire, the family had tried to get rid of the painting by burning it in their garden, but they claimed the print refused to catch fire, remaining intact even when placed directly in flames. This account was published in The Sun and added to the growing mythology surrounding the cursed paintings. The media attention surrounding the crying boy curse reached its peak in October 1985, when The Sun launched a dramatic publicity campaign encouraging readers to bring their crying boy paintings to the newspaper's offices for mass destruction. The campaign was accompanied by sensational headlines declaring war on the cursed paintings and promising to rid Britain of their malevolent influence. Hundreds of people responded to this call, travelling from across the country to deliver their crying boy prints to The Sun's London headquarters. The newspaper organised a public bonfire where the collected paintings were ceremonially burned, with photographers documenting the event and reporters interviewing people who claimed to have been victimised by the curse. However, even this supposedly definitive solution to the curse proved problematic. Several witnesses at the mass burning reported that some of the paintings seemed reluctant to catch fire, requiring multiple attempts and additional accelerants before they would burn completely. Others claimed that strange sounds emanated from the flames, describing noises that resembled children crying or screaming. While these accounts were likely influenced by the heightened emotions and expectations of the crowd, they added another layer to the growing legend and convinced many believers that the paintings possessed genuine supernatural properties. The scientific community began to take notice of the crying boy phenomenon, not because researchers believed in the curse, but because the consistency of the reported incidents suggested there might be a rational explanation for why these particular prints survived fires more often than other artwork. In 1988, the Building Research Establishment, a British government agency that investigates fire safety and building standards, conducted laboratory tests on crying boy prints to determine if there were any unusual properties that might explain their apparent fire resistance. The investigation revealed several interesting facts about the construction and materials used in the mass-produced prints. The researchers found that many of the crying boy prints had been treated with fire-retardant chemicals during the manufacturing process, a common practice for inexpensive artwork designed for home display. These flame-retardant treatments could significantly slow the burning process and might allow prints to survive fires that destroyed untreated materials. Additionally, the prints were often mounted behind glass and enclosed in frames, providing additional protection from direct flame contact. The Building Research Establishment tests also revealed that the varnish used on many crying boy prints contained flame-retardant compounds that would cause the paintings to char and become fire-resistant when exposed to high temperatures. This scientific explanation could account for why the paintings survived fires, but it did not explain why homes containing these particular prints seemed to experience fires more frequently than would be statistically expected. The researchers concluded that while the painting's survival could be explained by their fire-resistant properties, the apparent correlation between owning the prints and experiencing house fires remained unexplained. Statistical analysis of the fire reports associated with crying boy paintings proved difficult because there was no centralized database tracking the ownership of these mass-produced prints. However, insurance industry investigators who looked into the phenomenon found some interesting patterns. claims involving house fires where crying boy paintings were present did seem to occur at rates slightly higher than statistical averages, though the differences were not dramatic enough to be conclusive. More significantly, many of the reported fires had started from electrical faults or heating equipment problems, suggesting that the paintings themselves were not causing the fires but might somehow be present in homes with higher fire risks. Psychological researchers became interested in the crying boy phenomenon as an example of how belief in curses could influence perception and behaviour. Studies suggested that people who believed their paintings were cursed might unconsciously notice and remember fire-related incidents more acutely, creating a confirmation bias that reinforced their belief in the curse. Additionally, the emotional impact of the paintings themselves, images of crying children, might create subconscious anxiety that could influence how people interpreted ordinary household problems or minor incidents. The curse legend was further complicated by reports from art experts who questioned whether all the paintings being blamed for fires were actually created by Bruno Amadio. The popularity of the crying boy theme had led to numerous imitations and unauthorized copies, some of which were of much lower quality and might have been produced using different materials and manufacturing processes. This raised the possibility that some of the fire incidents were associated with poorly made copies rather than the original Amadio prints, potentially explaining some of the variation in reported phenomena. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, additional accounts of crying boy-related fires continued to surface, though media attention had largely moved on to other stories. Fire departments across Britain reported occasional incidents where these paintings had survived blazes, but the frequency seemed to decline as public awareness of the curse grew, and fewer people were willing to display the prints in their homes. Some investigators suggested that the decrease in reported incidents might indicate that the curse was self-limiting. As people became aware of the potential danger, they removed the paintings from their homes, naturally reducing the number of fire incidents associated with them. The international spread of the crying boy curse legend demonstrated how modern media could transform local folklore into global phenomena. Reports of cursed paintings surviving fires began appearing in other countries where the prints had been sold, including Australia, Canada, and parts of Europe. In each case, the basic elements of the story remained consistent. Mass-produced prints of crying children would survive house fires that destroyed everything else, leading to speculation about supernatural influences and cursed artwork. Modern investigations of the crying boy phenomenon have focused on the psychological and sociological aspects of the legend, rather than attempting to prove or disprove supernatural explanations. Researchers have noted that the curse emerged during a period of economic uncertainty in Britain, when many working-class families were struggling with unemployment and housing problems. The idea that inexpensive artwork could bring disaster to already vulnerable households may have resonated with deeper anxieties about economic instability and the precarious nature of domestic security. Contemporary fire safety experts who have studied the historical reports note that many of the houses that experienced crying boy-related fires had other risk factors that might have contributed to the incidents. Older working-class housing often featured outdated electrical systems, inadequate heating equipment, and overcrowded living conditions that increased fire risks regardless of what artwork was displayed on the walls. The correlation between crying boy paintings and house fires might reflect the social and economic demographics of the people who purchased these particular prints, rather than any supernatural properties of the artwork itself. Today, original crying boy prints have become collectible items, sought after by people interested in unusual folklore and paranormal artifacts, rather than feared as cursed objects. Online auction sites regularly feature these paintings, often with detailed descriptions of their notorious history and supposed supernatural properties. The transformation of the crying boy from feared curse object to quirky collectible demonstrates how cultural attitudes towards supernatural phenomena can evolve over time, influenced by changing social contexts and generational differences in belief systems. The Terracotta Army discovery. On March 29, 1974, 7 farmers from Xiang village in Xi'an, China, were digging a well during one of the worst droughts in the region's recent history when their shovels struck something hard, buried approximately 4 feet underground. What they had uncovered would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, but it would also mark the beginning of a pattern of tragedy and misfortune that would follow everyone closely involved with the excavation and study of what became known as the Terracotta Warriors. The farmers, Yang Jifa, Yang Peiyan, Yang Xinman, Yang Kuanyi, Wang Puji, Yao Shuzhong, and Liu Jushun, had accidentally broken through into an underground chamber that contained thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses and chariots that had been standing guard for over 2,200 years over the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who ruled from 259 to 210 BC, was known for his brutal methods of unifying China and his obsession with achieving immortality. Historical records describe him as a paranoid ruler who feared assassination and spent enormous resources on elaborate security measures, magical elixirs, and monumental construction projects designed to ensure his power would continue beyond death. The massive Terracotta Army discovered by the farmers was just one component of an enormous burial complex that covered over 38 square miles and took an estimated 700,000 labourers and craftsmen over 36 years to complete. Ancient Chinese historians recorded that many of the workers who built the tomb were buried alive inside it to prevent them from revealing its secrets, establishing a precedent of death and sacrifice that seemed to echo through the centuries. The initial discovery by the farmers revealed what appeared to be fragments of pottery and bronze weapons scattered throughout the excavation site. However, when archaeologist Zhao Kangmin arrived to investigate the find, he immediately recognized the significance of what had been uncovered. Zhao Kangmin was an experienced researcher who had spent decades studying ancient Chinese artifacts, but even he was unprepared for the magnitude of the discovery that lay beneath the farmland near Xi'an. As excavation work expanded throughout 1974 and 1975, it became clear that the site contained not just a few scattered artifacts, but an entire underground army of over 8,000 individual warriors, each with unique facial features, along with 130 chariots, 520 horses, and 150 cavalry horses. However, the triumph of this archaeological discovery was quickly overshadowed by a series of tragic events that began to affect those most closely involved with the excavation. The 7 farmers who had made the initial discovery found that their moment of fame brought them little benefit and considerable hardship. Despite the enormous cultural and economic value of their find, the farmers received minimal compensation from the Chinese government and were largely excluded from the financial benefits that the site would eventually generate through tourism and international exhibitions. More troubling were the personal tragedies that began to befall the group in the years following their discovery. Yang Jifa, who was considered the primary discoverer of the Terracotta Warriors, experienced a particularly difficult series of setbacks after 1974. Despite being invited to ceremonial events and occasionally asked to sign autographs for tourists visiting the site, Yang Jifa received very little monetary compensation for his role in one of history's greatest archaeological discoveries. He struggled with poverty throughout his later years, living in the same modest village home where he had been born and working occasional jobs to supplement the tiny pension he received from the government. More significantly, Yang Jifa's family was struck by a series of illnesses and accidents that seemed disproportionately severe compared to other families in the village. The pattern of misfortune extended to the other farmers who had participated in the original discovery. Wang Puji, one of the 7 original discoverers, died in 1999 at the age of 54 under circumstances that his family described as mysterious. Wang had been in relatively good health and was working in his fields when he suddenly collapsed and died, with medical examinations unable to determine a specific cause of death. His family members noted that Wang had frequently complained of feeling watched and uncomfortable whenever he visited the Terracotta Warrior excavation site, describing sensations of dread and anxiety that he had never experienced before the 1974 discovery. Yao Shuzhong, another member of the original group, died in 1997 under tragic circumstances that shocked the local community. Yao had become increasingly depressed and withdrawn in the years following the discovery, apparently troubled by the lack of recognition and financial compensation he'd received for his role in the find. Friends and family members described Yao as becoming obsessed with the idea that he and the other farmers had been cursed by disturbing the ancient emperor's resting place. On a cold winter evening in 1997, Yao was found hanged in his home, having apparently taken his own life. His suicide note mentioned feeling haunted by dreams of ancient soldiers and expressed regret about having disturbed the underground army. Liu Jushan, the third member of the discovery group to die, passed away in his early 50s from what was officially described as a sudden illness. However, family members reported that Liu had been experiencing strange symptoms for months before his death, including severe headaches, unexplained fevers, and episodes of disorientation that medical professionals could not diagnose or treat. Most disturbing were Liu's reports of hearing voices speaking in what sounded like ancient Chinese, voices that seemed to come from underground and were particularly noticeable when he was working in fields near the excavation site. The deaths among the original discoverers were not the only casualties associated with the Terracotta Warriors excavation. Several archaeologists and researchers who worked extensively with the artifacts also experienced unusual health problems and personal tragedies. Dr. Zhao Kangmin, the archaeologist who had first recognized the significance of the farmer's discovery and led much of the early research, developed respiratory problems that progressively worsened throughout his career. Zhao Kangmin spent decades studying the Terracotta Warriors, often working in poorly ventilated underground chambers where dust and chemical residues from the ancient burial environment posed constant health risks. The excavation work itself presented numerous hazards that may have contributed to health problems among researchers and workers. Soil analysis revealed unusually high levels of mercury throughout the burial complex, consistent with ancient Chinese records indicating that Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb was surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury, designed to represent the geography of his empire. Mercury poisoning can cause neurological problems, respiratory difficulties, and other serious health issues that develop gradually over time, potentially explaining some of the symptoms experienced by people who spent extended periods working at the excavation site. Additionally, the underground chambers where the Terracotta Warriors were discovered contained high levels of ammonia and other toxic gases that had accumulated over more than 2 millennia. These environmental hazards posed significant risks to anyone working in the confined spaces of the burial pits, particularly before modern safety equipment and ventilation systems were installed. Several excavation workers reported experiencing dizziness, nausea, and respiratory problems while working in the deeper sections of the site, symptoms that were initially attributed to the physical demands of archaeological work, but later recognized as potential signs of chemical exposure. The preservation challenges faced by the Terracotta Warriors also created additional health risks for researchers and conservators. When first exposed to air and light, the warriors' original paint and lacquer coatings began to deteriorate rapidly, releasing chemical compounds into the surrounding environment. The pigments used in the original decoration included cinnabar, lead, and other toxic substances that posed inhalation and contact hazards for anyone working closely with the artifacts. Several conservators who spent extensive time cleaning and treating individual warriors developed skin conditions and respiratory problems that were potentially linked to exposure to these ancient chemicals. Beyond the immediate physical hazards, many researchers and workers reported experiencing psychological stress and anxiety while working at the Terracotta Warriors site. The sheer scale of the burial complex and its association with mass death, both ancient and modern, created an atmosphere that many found emotionally overwhelming. Archaeological evidence indicated that thousands of workers had been killed during the tomb's construction, and the discovery of mass graves containing the remains of labourers and craftsmen added to the site's grim reputation. Dr. Zhao Kangmin himself experienced what he described as an increasing sense of unease as his research progressed deeper into the burial complex. In interviews conducted during his later years, Zhao described feeling as though he was being watched while working alone in the excavation pits, and reported hearing unexplained sounds that seemed to come from areas where no other people were present. These experiences became more frequent and intense as excavation work revealed additional chambers and artifacts, leading some observers to wonder if the psychological stress of working in such a historically significant but ominous environment was affecting the mental health of researchers. The economic impact of the Terracotta Warriors' discovery created additional stress for the local community, including the original farmers who'd made the find. While the site became a major tourist attraction that brought significant revenue to the region, most of this economic benefit went to government agencies and tourism companies, rather than to the individuals who had risked their lives and livelihoods to uncover the ancient army. The surviving farmers were occasionally employed to sit at tables near the visitor centre, signing books and postcards for tourists. but these appearances paid very little and served more as curiosities than as recognition of their historical contribution. The international fame of the Terracotta Warriors also attracted treasure hunters and black market antiquities dealers who saw opportunities for illegal profit. Several attempts were made to steal artifacts from the site, and some succeeded in removing smaller pieces that were later sold on the international art market. These thefts created additional security concerns and required increased surveillance that further restricted access for legitimate researchers. More troubling were reports of violence associated with the illegal antiquities trade, including threats against museum staff and researchers who refused to cooperate with criminal enterprises. In 2018, Dr. Jiao Kangmin died at the age of 81 from what was officially described as a pulmonary infection, though family members noted that his respiratory problems had been gradually worsening for years. His death marked the end of an era for Terracotta Warriors research, as he had been the primary authority on the discovery and had personally supervised much of the early excavation work. Jiao Kangmin's passing was mourned by the international archaeological community, but some observers noted the irony that his life had been devoted to studying an ancient emperor's attempt to achieve immortality, only to succumb to lung problems that may have been related to his decades of work in the toxic environment of the burial complex. Modern excavation work at the Terracotta Warriors site continues under much stricter safety protocols, with advanced ventilation systems, protective equipment, and environmental monitoring designed to protect workers from the chemical and biological hazards present in the ancient burial chambers. However, the excavation is proceeding much more slowly than originally planned, partly due to these safety concerns, and partly due to the recognition that premature exposure to air and light causes irreversible damage to the artifacts. Current estimates suggest that it may take several more decades to fully excavate and study all of the Terracotta Warriors, assuming that funding and political support for the project continue. The surviving members of the original farmer discovery group, Yang Zhifa, Yang Peiyan, Yang Xinman, and Yang Kuanyi, continue to live in or near Xiyang village, where they occasionally meet with journalists and researchers interested in their story. Now, in their 70s and 80s, these men have witnessed their accidental discovery transform from a local curiosity into one of the world's most famous archaeological sites, though they have received relatively little personal benefit from their role in history: the curse of the Scottish play. In theatres around the world, there is one name that actors refuse to speak aloud when they are inside a playhouse. Instead of saying Macbeth, they call it the Scottish play. This superstition has survived for over 400 years, and the reason is simple. Too many people believe that speaking the name of Shakespeare's darkest tragedy will bring death and disaster to anyone involved in the production. The Curse of Macbeth is not just theatre legend. It has a documented history that stretches back to the very first performance in 1606. According to historical records, the boy actor who was supposed to play Lady Macbeth became seriously ill just before the opening night. He died shortly after, and Shakespeare himself had to step in to play the role. From that first performance, people began to notice that productions of Macbeth seemed to attract more accidents, injuries, and deaths than any other play in the theatre. The most violent incident connected to Macbeth happened in New York in 1849. Two famous actors, Edwin Forrest from America and William Charles Macready from England, were both performing Macbeth in competing productions. The rivalry between their fans became so intense that it led to the Astor Place riot. On May 10, 1849, thousands of people gathered outside the theatre where Macready was performing. The crowd became violent, throwing stones and trying to storm the building. The National Guard was called in, and they opened fire on the crowd. By the end of the night, 22 people were dead and over 100 were injured. This was not just a theatre accident. It was a full-scale riot that turned deadly, all connected to performances of Macbeth. The Lincoln assassination also has connections to the Macbeth curse. John Wilkes Booth, the actor who shot President Abraham Lincoln, was the brother of Edwin Booth, one of the most famous Macbeth actors of the 19th century. John Wilkes Booth himself had performed in Macbeth multiple times before he committed the most infamous murder in American political history. Some theatre historians point out that the assassination happened during a time when both Booth brothers were heavily involved in Shakespearean productions, including Macbeth. In the 20th century, the accidents continued. During a 1937 production at the Old Vic in London, Laurence Olivier, one of the greatest actors of his generation, was performing Macbeth when a 25-pound stage weight fell from the ceiling and missed his head by inches. In the same production, the director had a heart attack, and the actor playing Duncan was stabbed in the eye during the fight scene and nearly lost his sight. The sword that injured him broke in half and the broken piece flew into the audience, barely missing spectators. Another famous incident happened in 1942 when actor Maurice Evans was performing Macbeth. During the sleepwalking scene, the actress playing Lady Macbeth actually began sleepwalking for real on stage. She walked straight off the stage and fell into the orchestra pit, breaking her leg. The production had to be stopped, and she never fully recovered from her injuries. In 1953, Charlton Heston was performing Macbeth in an outdoor production when his horse was spooked by the stage effects. The horse reared up and threw Heston to the ground, giving him a concussion. Later in the same production, Heston suffered severe burns during the final battle scene when his tights caught fire from a torch. The fire spread so quickly that he had to roll on the ground to put out the flames while still trying to deliver his lines. The accidents are not limited to famous actors. In 1971, a production in England had to be cancelled after the actor playing Macbeth was injured in a car accident on his way to the theatre. The actor who replaced him broke his leg during rehearsal. The third replacement actor came down with a severe case of food poisoning on opening night. The production was finally cancelled after the theatre's lighting system caught fire during what was supposed to be the final attempt at a performance. Some of the most disturbing incidents involve deaths that seem to follow the play. In 1849, the same year as the Astor Place riot, 3 actors died during different productions of Macbeth in different cities. In 1937, the year of Olivier's near miss with the falling weight, 7 people connected to various Macbeth productions died in accidents. In 1971, 4 deaths were reported among cast and crew members of different Macbeth productions around the world. Theatre professionals have tried to find logical reasons for why Macbeth seems to be more accident-prone than other plays. The play requires sword fighting, which can be dangerous. It often uses dim lighting to create atmosphere, which makes it easier for actors to trip or walk into scenery. The play has complex staging with multiple levels, trapdoors, and special effects that can malfunction. The psychological intensity of the roles can affect an actor's concentration and make them more likely to make mistakes. But the statistics seem to go beyond what can be explained by the play's technical demands. Insurance companies have actually documented that Macbeth productions have a higher rate of accidents and claims than other Shakespearean plays, even those with similar staging requirements. Some theatres require special insurance policies for Macbeth productions because of the historical pattern of incidents. The superstition has created its own set of rules and rituals. If an actor accidentally says Macbeth inside a theatre, they must immediately leave the building, turn around 3 times, spit, knock on the door, and ask permission to re-enter. Some actors add to this ritual by reciting lines from other Shakespeare plays to cleanse themselves. These rules are taken seriously by professional actors, and violations can lead to being banned from some theatres. Modern productions continue to report unusual incidents. In 2001, a Broadway production starring Kelsey Grammer had to be postponed when Grammer injured his back. Later, the same production was disrupted when the actor playing Macduff was injured in a stage fight. In 2016, a production in London was cancelled after multiple cast members became ill with what doctors described as an unusually severe flu outbreak that affected only people connected to the production. The belief in the curse has become so strong that it affects the psychology of everyone involved in Macbeth productions. Actors report feeling nervous and distracted, which can contribute to accidents. Some refuse to perform in the play at all. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the fear of the curse makes people more likely to have accidents, which then reinforces the belief in the curse. Scientists who have studied the phenomenon point out that people remember accidents and unusual events more clearly than routine successful performances. They also note that Macbeth is performed more often than most other Shakespearean tragedies, which naturally increases the chances of accidents simply through frequency. The dark subject matter of the play might make people more likely to notice and remember negative events associated with it. However, the documented incidents span centuries and continents, affecting people who had no prior knowledge of the superstition. The pattern of accidents, injuries, and deaths connected to Macbeth productions is extensive enough that many insurance companies and theatre managers treat it as a statistical reality, regardless of whether they believe in supernatural causes. The Tutankhamun's tomb, November the 26th, 1922. The Valley of the Kings shimmers in the Egyptian heat as Howard Carter raises his trembling hand to widen the small hole he has just cut through the ancient sealed doorway. Behind him, Lord Carnarvon shifts impatiently in the suffocating air of the narrow corridor, while Egyptian workers hold oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the limestone walls. Carter has spent 15 years searching for this moment, following clues and fragments that led him to believe that somewhere in this royal cemetery lay the undisturbed tomb of a boy pharaoh who died over 3,000 years ago. As he inserts a candle through the opening and peers into the darkness beyond, the flame flickers in the stale air that has been trapped for millennia. What Carter sees in that dancing light stops his breath. The glint of gold everywhere, wonderful things scattered throughout a chamber that no human eye has seen since the reign of Tutankhamun ended in 1323 BCE. "Can you see anything?" Lord Carnarvon asks anxiously from behind him. Carter's response becomes one of the most famous phrases in archaeological history: "Yes, wonderful things." But in his excitement, Carter has no way of knowing that his discovery will unleash something far more terrible than wonderful, a curse that will claim the lives of those who dare disturb the eternal rest of Egypt's boy king. The tomb that Carter has found is unlike anything discovered in Egypt before. Where other royal burials were looted centuries ago by ancient grave robbers, Tutankhamun's resting place remains essentially intact, sealed since the day the young pharaoh was laid to rest. The outer chamber is packed with treasures that defy description: golden chariots, ornate furniture, weapons encrusted with precious stones, and countless artifacts that reveal the incredible wealth and sophistication of ancient Egyptian civilization. But these material wonders are only the beginning. As Carter and his team begin the painstaking process of cataloguing and removing the artifacts, they gradually uncover evidence of something more sinister woven into the tomb's construction. Tutankhamun became pharaoh around the age of 9 and ruled for only about 10 years before his mysterious death at approximately 19 years old. Modern medical analysis of his mummy suggests he may have died from complications related to a broken leg, possibly infected, though some researchers theorize he was murdered by political rivals who wanted to end his family's dynasty. What makes his story particularly tragic is that he was one of the last pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, a royal line that had ruled Egypt during its most prosperous and powerful period. His tomb was prepared hastily after his unexpected death, but the priests and embalmers who laid him to rest were determined that nothing should disturb his journey to the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian burial practices were designed to protect the dead from any interference with their eternal rest. The tomb's entrance was hidden beneath debris from later construction, and the sealed doorways were marked with warnings written in hieroglyphs that promised swift death to anyone who violated the pharaoh's resting place. These were not mere superstitions, but religious beliefs backed by the full power of Egypt's priesthood, who understood that the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife was essential for the kingdom's continued prosperity. The curses inscribed on Tutankhamun's tomb were particularly elaborate, calling upon the gods of the underworld to strike down anyone who disturbed the young king's eternal sleep. The first signs of the curse appear almost immediately after the tomb's discovery. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's wealthy patron who had funded the excavation for years, is bitten by a mosquito while visiting the tomb. The bite becomes infected, and despite medical treatment, Carnarvon's condition worsens rapidly. On April 5th, 1923, just 5 months after the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon dies in Cairo. His death might seem like simple bad luck, but witnesses report strange phenomena surrounding his final hours. At the moment of Carnarvon's death, all the lights in Cairo mysteriously go out for several minutes, and his favourite dog back in England howls and drops dead at the same instant, though no one can explain how the animal could have known of its master's death thousands of miles away. The media seizes upon Carnarvon's death as evidence of an ancient curse, but Howard Carter dismisses such claims as nonsense. Carter is a scientist and rationalist who believes that careful methodology and modern technology can overcome any dangers posed by ancient tomb builders. However, as the excavation continues and more treasures are removed from the tomb, a disturbing pattern of deaths and misfortunes begins to affect everyone connected with the discovery. Within 2 years of the tomb's opening, 12 people who were present at various stages of the excavation have died under circumstances that seem to defy statistical probability. Arthur Mace, the American archaeologist who helped Carter break down the sealed wall between the tomb's chambers, falls ill with a mysterious weakness and dies in 1923, just months after completing his work. George J. Gould, a wealthy American financier who visited the tomb as Carnarvon's guest, dies of fever shortly after returning to the United States. Radiologist Archibald Douglas Reed, who x-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy, becomes violently ill immediately after the procedure and dies within days. The pattern is always the same: initial exposure to the tomb or its contents, followed by rapid illness and death that medical experts cannot adequately explain. The curse appears to operate with disturbing precision, targeting those who had the most direct contact with Tutankhamun's burial goods, while sparing casual visitors or those who maintained respectful distance from the tomb's treasures. Professor Hugh Evelyn White, a philologist who studied the hieroglyphic inscriptions in the tomb, becomes convinced that he has been marked for death by the ancient curses. His letters to colleagues describe growing paranoia and a sense of impending doom that eventually drives him to suicide. Before his death, Evelyn White writes a final note stating, "I have succumbed to a curse which forces me to disappear." Scientific analysis of the deaths reveals no common medical cause, no shared exposure to toxins or infectious diseases that might explain the mortality rate among those connected to the tomb. However, several disturbing factors emerge from detailed investigation. Many of the victims experienced similar symptoms in their final days: high fever, disorientation, and a strange weakening that seemed to drain their life force rather than attack any specific organ system. More unsettling, several of the deceased had been heard speaking in their final delirium in what witnesses described as ancient Egyptian phrases, though none of the victims had any knowledge of the ancient language. The curse's influence extends beyond mere death to encompass a broader pattern of misfortune that affects families and associates of those who entered the tomb. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter who was present at the tomb's opening, survives the initial wave of deaths, but experiences a lifetime of personal tragedies, failed marriages, financial disasters, and health problems that plague her until her death decades later. The British Museum, which acquired several artefacts from the tomb, reports an unusual number of accidents and incidents among staff members who handled Tutankhamun's treasures, leading to unofficial policies limiting exposure to the ancient objects. Howard Carter himself presents the most puzzling case in the pattern of the curse's effects. As the person most intimately involved with the tomb's excavation and the removal of its treasures, Carter should logically be the curse's primary target. Yet he lives for many years after the discovery, dying in 1939 at the age of 64 from natural causes. Some researchers suggest that Carter's survival proves the curse is merely coincidence and superstition. Others theorize that Carter's respectful treatment of Tutankhamun's remains and his genuine scholarly interest in preserving the pharaoh's legacy may have protected him from the worst effects of the ancient warnings. Modern scientific investigation has attempted to find rational explanations for the deaths associated with Tutankhamun's tomb. Some researchers propose that ancient tomb builders may have used toxic substances to protect burial chambers from grave robbers, creating genuine chemical hazards that could cause illness or death among excavators. Others suggest that sealed tombs might harbour dangerous bacteria or fungi that could prove fatal to people with compromised immune systems. However, these theories struggle to explain the highly selective nature of the curse's effects and the specific targeting of individuals based on their level of involvement with the tomb. Recent medical analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy using advanced imaging technology has revealed new details about the young pharaoh's death and burial that add disturbing elements to the curse legend. CT scans show that the mummification process was unusually hasty, with several procedural irregularities that suggest the embalmers were working under extreme time pressure. More significantly, analysis of the mummy's wrappings reveals traces of unusual resins and chemical compounds that were not typical of standard mummification procedures, suggesting that special measures were taken to ensure the pharaoh's protection in the afterlife. The tomb continues to yield new discoveries that add to its mysterious reputation. In 2010, DNA analysis revealed that Tutankhamun was likely the product of an incestuous relationship between siblings, and that he suffered from multiple genetic disorders that would have made his life painful and difficult. This genetic evidence supports theories that the young pharaoh's death was not just tragic, but deeply traumatic, potentially creating the emotional and spiritual conditions that might give rise to the kind of restless spirit described in ancient curse inscriptions. Archaeological work in the Valley of the Kings continues today, with researchers using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technology to search for additional chambers connected to Tutankhamun's tomb. Some evidence suggests that hidden rooms may exist behind the tomb's decorated walls, possibly containing additional treasures or even the burial of Queen Nefertiti. However, Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to authorize invasive exploration of these potential chambers, officially citing conservation concerns, but privately acknowledging the persistent association between the tomb and unexplained deaths. Tourism to Tutankhamun's tomb remains popular, but visitors and guides report unusual phenomena that echo the experiences of the original excavation team. Photographers frequently encounter technical problems when trying to capture images inside the burial chamber, with cameras malfunctioning or producing images that show unexplained shadows or lights. Some visitors report feeling dizzy or nauseous while standing near the pharaoh's sarcophagus, and a few have collapsed without warning, requiring medical attention that reveals no underlying health problems. The treasures of Tutankhamun continue to travel the world in museum exhibitions that draw millions of visitors, but these displays have their own associations with unexplained incidents. Security guards and museum staff report equipment failures, accidents, and general unease when working around the ancient artifacts. Several major exhibitions have been delayed or disrupted by technical problems that seem to cluster around the most significant pieces from the tomb, particularly items that were in direct contact with the pharaoh's mummy. The Petrified Forest stone thieves. In the high desert of northeastern Arizona lies one of America's most unique national parks. The Petrified Forest National Park is home to fallen trees that turned to stone over 200 million years ago. These ancient logs are not just rocks, they're rainbow-coloured fossils made of crystallized quartz that shine like jewels in the desert sun. But something strange happens to people who visit this park. They cannot resist taking pieces home with them, and then something even stranger happens: they mail them back. Since 1934, the Petrified Forest National Park has been receiving packages in the mail. Inside these packages are pieces of stolen petrified wood, along with letters. These letters, which park staff call conscience letters, all tell the same story. The people who wrote them took rocks from the park and then their lives fell apart. They blame the rocks for their bad luck, and they want to return them to make the curse stop. The park now has over 1,200 of these conscience letters in their archives. They come from all over the world: Italy, Germany, Japan, Australia, and every state in America. Some letters are written by children who took a small pebble. Others are written by adults who loaded bags full of petrified wood into their cars. But they all share the same message: please take back these cursed rocks. The letters describe every kind of misfortune you can imagine. People write about car accidents, house fires, job losses, divorces, serious illnesses, and deaths in their families. They blame all of these problems on the rocks they stole from the park. One letter from 1981 simply says, "This rock was taken without knowledge of the curse. Sorry, Anonymous." Another letter describes how the writer's love life turned into pure havoc after taking rocks from the park. A woman from Colorado wrote about taking a single small piece of petrified wood in 1988. After she got home, her husband left her, she lost her job, her house was burglarized, and her car broke down multiple times. She was convinced the rock was causing all her problems. She mailed it back with a letter begging the park to take it back and end her bad luck. A family from New York wrote about their vacation to the park in 1995. Their teenage son took several pieces of petrified wood, even though his parents told him not to. Within a month of returning home, the father was laid off from his job, the mother was diagnosed with cancer, and their son was injured in a car accident. The family was sure the stolen rocks were cursed. They returned every piece they could find and asked the park to forgive them for taking them. One of the most detailed letters came from a man in Ohio in 2003. He wrote about taking a large piece of petrified wood during a camping trip. Over the next 2 years, he was in 3 car accidents. His wife filed for divorce. His business failed and his house was damaged in a storm. He became convinced that the rock was bringing him bad luck. When he finally mailed it back to the park, he included a 5-page letter describing every terrible thing that had happened since he took the rock. The conscience letters are not just from individuals. Some come from families who discovered that a relative had taken rocks from the park decades earlier. After that person died, the family members started having their own run of bad luck. They found the rocks among the deceased person's belongings and immediately mailed them back to the park, hoping to end what they believed was a family curse. Children write some of the most touching letters. A 10-year-old girl from Texas wrote in 1999 about taking a small piece of wood during a school field trip. After she got home, her pet hamster died, she broke her arm falling off her bike, and she started having nightmares. Her parents helped her mail the rock back to the park. She drew pictures on her letter showing the rock being happy to go home. Some letters are short and desperate. "Please take this back," one person wrote in 2001. "I should never have taken it. My life has been nothing but bad luck ever since." Others are long and detailed, describing years of problems that the writers attribute to their stolen rocks. The park staff has studied the phenomenon carefully. They estimate that they receive between 12 and 18 conscience letters every month, along with packages containing returned rocks. The volume increases whenever the curse is mentioned in movies, TV shows, or news articles. In 2019, when a Netflix show mentioned the curse, the park saw a significant spike in returned rocks and letters. Museum curator Matthew Smith has worked with the conscience letters for years. He points out that many of the letters are not even written by the original thieves. Instead, they are written by family members, friends, or people who bought rocks from gift shops and mistakenly thought they were stolen from the park. Some of the returned rocks are clearly not from the Petrified Forest at all. They are polished stones that were obviously purchased in souvenir shops. The park faces a dilemma with these returned rocks. Even though people think they are doing the right thing by sending them back, the rocks cannot be returned to their original locations in the park. The staff does not know exactly where each rock came from, and putting them back in the wrong places would damage the scientific value of the site. Instead, all the returned rocks go to what the staff calls the conscience pile, a growing mound of stones located near a private service road that visitors never see. The irony is not lost on park officials. People steal rocks hoping to take home a piece of something beautiful and ancient. When they think the rocks are cursed, they mail them back hoping to make their lives better. But the returned rocks end up in a pile where they will never be seen or appreciated by anyone. They exist in a kind of purgatory, neither part of the natural landscape nor part of anyone's collection. The curse legend may have started with a park ranger in Hawaii in the 1940s. According to stories, this ranger told visitors that taking lava rocks from Hawaiian volcanoes would anger Pele, the goddess of fire. This story supposedly spread to other national parks, including the Petrified Forest. But similar beliefs about cursed objects exist in cultures around the world, so it is hard to know exactly how the idea started. For many years, the park accidentally encouraged the belief in the curse. They displayed some of the conscience letters in their visitor centre, thinking it would be interesting for tourists to see. But this had the opposite effect. Visitors would read the letters, take rocks anyway, and then later blame their problems on the curse. Some letters specifically mentioned seeing earlier letters at the park. "I saw the letters, but I didn't believe it and I took the rocks anyway, and now I'm cursed." The park eventually stopped displaying the letters because they realised it was making the problem worse. People were reading about the curse and then either taking rocks to test it or becoming convinced they were cursed after reading about other people's bad luck. Modern research shows that theft from the park is much less common than officials once believed. Using historical photographs, park staff compared pictures of rock formations from 100 years ago with current photographs. In over 200 comparisons, they found only one case where rocks had clearly been removed by thieves. The park looks essentially the same as it did a century ago. The park has tried different approaches to prevent theft. They've used scary warning signs, given out small rock samples at the entrance, and handed out flyers about fines for stealing. Nothing seems to work completely. Some people still take rocks, and some of those people still mail them back with letters about bad luck. Park officials now try to focus on education, rather than warnings about curses or fines. They explain the scientific importance of leaving the rocks where they are, and help visitors understand that the formations are protected for research and future generations. They've moved away from any messaging that might encourage belief in supernatural curses. But the letters keep coming. Every month packages arrive with rocks and stories of misfortune. The conscience pile keeps growing. And somewhere in America and around the world, people are looking at pieces of petrified wood on their shelves and wondering if their recent run of bad luck might be connected to that vacation they took to Arizona years ago. The Peacock Throne. In 1628, Emperor Shah Jahan of the Mughal Empire commissioned what would become one of history's most famous royal seats, the Peacock Throne, known in Persian as Takht-e-Taus. The project began during the height of Mughal power, when the empire controlled vast territories across the Indian subcontinent and commanded enormous wealth through trade and tribute. Shah Jahan, already known for his ambitious architectural projects including the Taj Mahal, envisioned a throne that would represent the pinnacle of Mughal craftsmanship and imperial power. The construction of the throne took 7 years to complete, involving the empire's most skilled jewelers, goldsmiths and artisans. Historical accounts, particularly those of the French traveller Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who visited the Mughal court in the 1660s, provide detailed descriptions of the throne's construction and appearance. The throne was built using approximately 1,150 kilograms of gold and 230 kilograms of precious stones. The structure measured roughly 6 feet in height and 10 feet in width, featuring 12 emerald-covered pillars supporting a jewelled canopy. The throne's distinctive name came from the 2 peacocks positioned at its rear, their tails spread in display and covered with precious gems. The peacocks' bodies were made of gold, while their elaborate tail feathers were outlined with rubies, emeralds, and diamonds. The throne's base was decorated with representations of flowers and leaves, all crafted from precious metals and studded with gems. Contemporary chroniclers reported that the throne contained thousands of precious stones, including numerous large diamonds, rubies weighing over 200 carats each, and countless pearls and emeralds. The throne was positioned in the Divani Khas, or Hall of Private Audiences, within the Red Fort in Delhi. From this elevated seat, Shah Jahan held court and conducted the empire's most important business. The throne served not only as a symbol of imperial authority, but also as a practical demonstration of the Mughal Empire's wealth and the emperor's access to precious materials from across Asia. The gems incorporated into its design came from various parts of the empire and beyond, including diamonds from the Deccan mines, rubies from Myanmar, and emeralds from Colombia that had reached India through trade networks. Shah Jahan ruled from the Peacock Throne until 1658, when his son Aurangzeb deposed him in a succession war. The aging emperor spent his final years under house arrest in the Agra fort, never again permitted to sit upon his magnificent creation. Aurangzeb claimed the throne and ruled from it as the 6th Mughal emperor, but his reign marked the beginning of the empire's gradual decline. His military campaigns and religious policies created internal conflicts that weakened central authority, though the throne remained in Mughal hands in Delhi. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Peacock Throne passed through a succession of weaker Mughal rulers who struggled to maintain control over their fragmenting empire. The throne remained in the Red Fort throughout this period of decline, but the empire's military strength and territorial control continued to erode. Regional governors became increasingly independent, and external threats mounted as neighbouring powers recognised Mughal weakness. The throne's fate changed dramatically in 1739 when Nadir Shah, the ruler of Persia, invaded India. After defeating Mughal forces at the Battle of Karnal, Nadir Shah's army marched to Delhi and occupied the city. The Persian conqueror demanded an enormous tribute from the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah, but when negotiations broke down, he ordered the systematic looting of Delhi's accumulated wealth. The sack of Delhi lasted for several weeks, during which Nadir Shah's forces confiscated the imperial treasury's contents, including the Peacock Throne. Contemporary accounts describe the Persian army's methodical removal of Delhi's treasures. Along with the Peacock Throne, Nadir Shah's forces took the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, numerous other precious stones, gold and art objects accumulated over centuries of Mughal rule. Historians estimate that the total value of the loot taken from Delhi was equivalent to several years of the Persian Empire's entire revenue. The Peacock Throne was carefully dismantled and transported to Persia, along with other major treasures. The throne's journey to Persia marked the end of its role as the seat of Mughal power in India. Nadir Shah had the throne reassembled in his capital, where it became a symbol of his military victories and the wealth of his expanded empire. However, the Persian ruler's possession of the throne was relatively brief. In 1747, just 8 years after his conquest of Delhi, Nadir Shah was assassinated by his own officers during a military campaign. His death threw the Persian Empire into chaos and began a period of civil war and political instability. Following Nadir Shah's assassination, the fate of the original Peacock Throne becomes unclear in historical records. Some accounts suggest that the throne was broken apart during the chaos following the ruler's death, with its precious stones and gold distributed among various Persian nobles and military commanders. Other sources indicate that portions of the throne may have been preserved, though their exact whereabouts remain disputed among historians. The political fragmentation that followed Nadir Shah's death meant that different groups claimed possession of various pieces of the original throne. The Zand dynasty, which gained control of much of Persia after Nadir Shah's death, and the later Qajar dynasty both claimed to possess elements of the original Mughal throne. However, authenticating these claims has proven difficult for modern historians, as the political chaos of the period resulted in incomplete records and conflicting accounts. During the 19th century, the legend of the Peacock Throne continued to influence Persian politics and craftsmanship. The Qajar dynasty, which ruled Persia from 1789 to 1925, constructed new thrones that incorporated elements claimed to be from the original Mughal throne. The most notable of these is the Sun Throne, also called the Peacock Throne, which was built during the reign of Fath Ali Shah Qajar in the early 19th century. This throne incorporated some precious stones that may have originated from Nadir Shah's Delhi loot, though determining their exact provenance remains challenging. The question of what happened to the original Peacock Throne's components has attracted the attention of historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters for centuries. Various institutions and private collectors have claimed to possess fragments of the original throne, but verifying these claims requires extensive historical and gemological analysis. The political instability in Persia and later Iran during much of the 19th and 20th centuries has complicated efforts to trace the throne's remains systematically. Modern Iran houses several thrones in its national jewelry treasury in Tehran, including the Sun Throne, which incorporates thousands of precious stones and displays the characteristic peacock motifs associated with the original Mughal throne. While some of these stones may have originated from Nadir Shah's Delhi conquest, establishing direct connections to the original Peacock Throne requires careful historical and scientific analysis that has been limited by political and practical constraints. The story of the Peacock Throne also intersects with the histories of other famous jewels taken during Nadir Shah's invasion. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, which was incorporated into the throne's design, eventually made its way through various rulers before being acquired by the British East India Company and incorporated into the British crown jewels. The Timur ruby, another stone associated with the Mughal treasury, also changed hands multiple times before ending up in the British collection. These individual gems provide more traceable histories than the throne itself, which was dismantled and dispersed. Archaeological and historical research into the Peacock Throne continues today, though it faces significant challenges. The political situation in Afghanistan and Iran has limited access to historical sites and records that might contain information about the throne's fate. Additionally, the passage of nearly 3 centuries since the throne's removal from Delhi means that many potential sources of information have been lost or scattered across multiple countries and institutions. Contemporary scholarship on the Peacock Throne focuses on understanding its role in Mughal court culture, its influence on Persian and Indian artistic traditions, and its symbolic importance in the political narratives of both the Mughal and Persian empires. Researchers have used surviving historical accounts, artistic depictions, and comparative analysis of similar thrones to better understand the original throne's design and cultural significance. These studies contribute to broader understanding of Mughal imperial culture and the artistic exchange between Persian and Indian traditions. The throne story also provides insight into the economic and political relationships between the Mughal and Persian empires during the 18th century. Nadir Shah's invasion of India represented not just a military conquest but also an economic transaction that transferred enormous wealth from one empire to another. The removal of the Peacock Throne symbolized this transfer of power and resources. marking the end of Mughal dominance in the region and the temporary rise of Persian influence. Museums and institutions in India, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries continue to research objects that may be connected to the original Peacock Throne. The National Museum in Delhi, the Iran National Museum in Tehran, and various other institutions house artifacts claimed to be related to either the original throne or its later iterations. However, the complex history of the throne's dismantling and dispersal means that establishing definitive connections between these objects and the original Mughal creation remains a challenging task for historians and curators. The Mummy of Otzi. September 19, 1991 started as an ordinary hiking day for German tourists Helmut and Erika Simon as they trekked through the Ötztal Alps along the Austrian-Italian border. The couple had decided to take a detour from the marked trail when they spotted something brown protruding from the melting glacier ice at 10,530 feet above sea level. What they initially thought was the body of a modern mountaineer who had met with an accident turned out to be one of archaeology's greatest discoveries, and the beginning of what many would come to call one of history's most deadly curses. The naturally mummified remains belonged to a man who had died over 5,300 years ago, making him the oldest and best preserved human ever found in Europe. The media quickly dubbed him Otzi, the Iceman, after the valley where he was discovered, but his ancient presence would soon cast a shadow over everyone connected to his recovery and study. The initial recovery operation began 4 days after the discovery, on September 23, 1991. Austrian authorities, believing the body was within their territory, dispatched a recovery team led by Rainer Henn, a 64-year-old forensic pathologist from the University of Innsbruck. Henn was an experienced professional who had handled hundreds of death investigations throughout his career, approaching the Otzi case with the same scientific detachment he applied to all his work. The recovery proved challenging due to the remote location and the need to extract the mummy without damaging the preserved tissues and artifacts found with the body. Henn supervised the careful removal of Otzi's remains, along with his clothing, tools and weapons, including a copper axe that would later revolutionize understanding of Copper Age technology. Among those who assisted in guiding the recovery team to the remote discovery site was Kurt Fritz, a 52-year-old experienced mountaineer and rescue specialist from the South Tyrol region. Fritz knew the treacherous alpine terrain better than most, having spent decades leading mountain rescue operations in the area. His expertise was crucial in navigating the dangerous glacier conditions and ensuring the recovery team could safely access the site where Otzi lay frozen in time. Fritz worked closely with Henn during the extraction process, physically handling the mummy as they carefully removed it from its icy tomb. The operation took several hours, and Fritz was among the first people to actually touch the ancient remains, helping to lift and position the body for transportation to the laboratory in Innsbruck. The deaths began almost immediately. On October 24, 1992, just over a year after the discovery, Rainer Henn was driving to the University of Zurich to deliver a lecture about his findings from the Otzi examination. Henn was an experienced driver who had made the journey between Innsbruck and Zurich many times without incident. However, on this particular trip his car was involved in a head-on collision that killed him instantly. The accident occurred on a straight stretch of highway under clear weather conditions, with no obvious explanation for why Henn's vehicle crossed into oncoming traffic. Police investigators found no evidence of mechanical failure, medical emergency, or external factors that could have caused the crash. Colleagues who knew Henn described him as a cautious driver who was looking forward to presenting his research on what he considered the most significant discovery of his career. The second death struck even closer to the heart of the discovery. Kurt Fritz, the mountaineer who had guided researchers to Otzi's location and helped extract the mummy from the ice, died in an avalanche in the same mountain range where the Iceman had been found. The avalanche occurred in July 1993, during what should have been a relatively safe period for alpine travel. Fritz was leading a group of researchers back to the discovery site for follow-up investigations when an unexpected snowslide buried the party. Remarkably, Fritz was the only member of the group killed in the avalanche. His companions, who were rescued after several hours buried in the snow, later described how the avalanche seemed to target Fritz specifically, with the main force of the snow hitting exactly where he was standing, while the others, just meters away, were caught in much lighter debris. The scientific community initially dismissed these deaths as tragic coincidences, but the pattern of fatalities continued to grow. Konrad Spindler, the archaeologist who led the University of Innsbruck team responsible for Ötzi's initial scientific examination, became one of the most prominent voices studying the Iceman. Spindler was known for his rigorous scientific approach and had publicly dismissed suggestions of a curse, stating in interviews that he found such superstitions unworthy of serious academic consideration. However, in April 2005, Spindler died from complications related to multiple sclerosis, a disease he had been battling for several years. What made his death particularly notable in the context of the supposed curse was the timing. Spindler died just months after completing his definitive book about Ötzi, having dedicated the final years of his life to documenting everything known about the ancient man. The deaths were not limited to the primary researchers and recovery team members. Dieter Warnecke, who led the mountain rescue team that recovered Ötzi's remains from the glacier, died of a heart attack in 1999 at the age of 45. Warnecke had been in good health with no known cardiac problems, making his sudden death unexpected to family and colleagues. Like the others, Warnecke had physical contact with Ötzi's remains during the recovery operation, personally handling the mummy as it was extracted from the ice and transported to the helicopter for evacuation to the laboratory. Rainer Hölzel, a journalist who had extensively covered the Ötzi story and was among the first media representatives to view the remains, developed a brain tumour and died in 2004. Hölzel had written several articles about the discovery and had conducted interviews with many of the researchers involved in studying the mummy. His death added another layer to the growing list of people connected to Ötzi, who had died under various circumstances, leading some to expand the definition of the curse to include not just those who physically handled the remains, but anyone who had significant professional involvement with the case. The most dramatic and widely publicised death was that of Helmut Seemann himself, the German tourist who had made the original discovery. In October 2004, Simon returned to the Alps for a hiking trip, something he'd done regularly since his retirement. At 67 years old, Seemann was an experienced hiker who knew the mountain terrain well. However, during this particular trip, he became separated from his companions during a sudden snowstorm. Search and rescue teams looked for Simon for 8 days before finding his body in a ravine near the same area where he had discovered Ötzi 13 years earlier. The circumstances of Simon's death were eerily similar to what scientists believed had happened to Ötzi himself. Both men died alone in the mountains during bad weather, their bodies preserved by the cold until they were eventually found. Tom Loy, a molecular archaeologist from the University of Queensland who analysed blood samples from Ötzi's clothing and weapons, died in 2005 from a rare blood clotting disorder. Loy's work had been crucial in determining that Ötzi had been involved in violent conflict before his death, with DNA evidence showing blood from at least 4 different people on his weapons and clothing. Loy had spent years studying samples from the mummy and had made groundbreaking discoveries about the Iceman's final days. His death from a blood-related condition seemed particularly ominous given that his research had focused extensively on the blood evidence associated with Ötzi's violent demise. The scientific examination of Ötzi revealed that he had died violently, struck by an arrow that severed a major artery in his shoulder. The wound would have caused him to bleed to death within minutes, and evidence suggested he had been involved in hand-to-hand combat shortly before his death. CT scans and forensic analysis indicated that Ötzi was likely fleeing from enemies when he was shot, making his death the result of what was essentially a prehistoric murder. Some researchers began to wonder if the violent circumstances of Ötzi's death had somehow imprinted a malevolent energy on his remains, explaining the pattern of deaths among those who disturbed his final resting place. By 2005, 7 people directly connected to Ötzi's discovery and study had died under various circumstances. The ages at death ranged from 45 to 67, and the causes included car accidents, avalanches, heart attacks, brain tumours, blood disorders, multiple sclerosis complications, and hypothermia. While none of these causes were particularly unusual on their own, the concentration of deaths among such a specific group of people began to attract attention from both the media and the scientific community. Statistical analysis suggested that the death rate among Otzi-connected individuals was significantly higher than would be expected for a random group of similar age and profession. The curse theory gained additional credibility when it was revealed that several of the deceased had experienced unusual incidents or premonitions before their deaths. Helmut Simon had reportedly told friends that he felt a strange connection to Otzi and sometimes dreamed about the ancient man. Rainer Henn had mentioned to colleagues that he felt uneasy whenever he worked with Otzi's remains, describing a persistent feeling of being watched. Kurt Fritz had expressed concerns about returning to the discovery site, telling family members that he felt something was wrong with the mountain where Otzi had been found. Skeptics pointed out that the supposed curse victims were all involved in high-risk activities, or were of an age where serious health problems become more common. Mountain climbing, high-altitude research, and extensive travel for archaeological work all carry inherent dangers that could explain the elevated death rate. Additionally, many more people had been involved in Otzi's discovery and study without experiencing any unusual health problems or accidents. The University of Innsbruck alone had dozens of researchers and graduate students who worked with Otzi-related materials without incident. However, defenders of the curse theory noted several unusual patterns in the deaths that seemed to go beyond statistical coincidence. Many of the victims died in ways that were somehow connected to their work with Otzi. The forensic pathologist died while travelling to lecture about the mummy, the mountaineer died in an avalanche in the same mountain range where Otzi was found, and the discoverer died in similar circumstances to the ancient man himself. The blood researcher died of a blood disorder, and several victims reported feeling watched or uneasy when working with Otzi's remains. Archaeological curses have precedent in other high-profile discoveries, most notably the supposed curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, though the Otzi case differs in several important ways. The deaths associated with Otzi occurred over a longer time period and involved people with varying degrees of connection to the discovery, rather than being concentrated among a single expedition team. Additionally, the victims came from different countries and professional backgrounds, making it less likely that shared environmental factors or occupational hazards could explain all the deaths. The Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where Otzi is now permanently housed, has had to address questions about the curse from both researchers and the public. Museum officials maintain detailed records of everyone who works with Otzi's remains and have implemented safety protocols that go beyond standard museum practices. Interestingly, no museum staff members who work regularly with the display have reported health problems or unusual incidents, suggesting that whatever force might be at work seems to primarily affect those involved in the original discovery and early research phases. Recent developments have added new dimensions to the Otzi curse discussion. In 2016, advanced DNA analysis revealed new details about Otzi's genetic makeup and health conditions, work that involved researchers from multiple institutions handling tissue samples from the mummy. So far, none of these recent researchers have reported unusual health problems or accidents, though given the timeline of previous curse-related deaths, it may be too early to draw conclusions about whether the pattern has ended. The Delhi Purple Sapphire. Despite its name, the Delhi Purple Sapphire is not actually a sapphire at all, but rather a 312-carat amethyst that has earned one of the most sinister reputations in the world of cursed gemstones. The stone's dark history begins in 1857 during the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, when British forces were brutally suppressing the uprising across northern India. In the city of Kanpur, formerly known as Cawnpore, where some of the rebellion's bloodiest massacres had taken place, British soldiers systematically looted temples and private homes as they regained control of the territory. Among the sacred objects stolen from the Temple of Indra, a Hindu temple dedicated to the king of gods and the god of rain and thunderstorms, was a large purple amethyst that had been used in religious ceremonies for generations. The theft of this sacred stone from its holy sanctuary would prove to be the beginning of over a century of documented misfortune, financial ruin, and mysterious deaths that would follow everyone who dared to possess it. The first victim of what would become known as the Delhi Purple Sapphire's curse was Colonel W. Ferris of the Bengal Cavalry, the British officer who physically removed the amethyst from the temple and claimed it as his personal trophy of war. Ferris was an experienced military man who had served with distinction in various colonial campaigns, building a reputation as a competent and reliable officer. However, From the moment he took possession of the amethyst, his life began to unravel in ways that defied rational explanation. Within months of returning to England with the stone, Ferris began experiencing a series of catastrophic setbacks that would ultimately destroy both his military career and his personal life. His previously stable financial situation collapsed as investments failed and debts mounted, forcing him to sell family property that had been in his possession for generations. The curse's impact on the Ferris family extended far beyond financial difficulties. Colonel Ferris himself suffered from deteriorating health, developing a mysterious illness that military doctors could neither diagnose nor treat effectively. His symptoms included severe headaches, unexplained fevers, and periods of delirium during which he would speak of seeing shadowy figures moving through his home. Family members reported that Ferris became increasingly paranoid and withdrawn, constantly checking locks and peering out windows as if expecting some unseen enemy to appear. His wife began experiencing her own health problems, including chronic insomnia and anxiety attacks that seemed to worsen whenever she was in the same room as the amethyst. The tragic culmination of the Ferris family's ordeal came when the colonel's son, a promising young officer following in his father's footsteps, died suddenly during military training under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official report listed the cause of death as a training accident, but fellow officers who witnessed the incident described it as impossible and inexplicable. The young man had been performing a routine drill that he'd completed successfully hundreds of times before when he suddenly collapsed and died, with no obvious injury or medical emergency to account for his death. This final tragedy broke Colonel Ferris completely, and he died shortly afterward, with family members attributing his death to grief and the accumulated stress of the inexplicable disasters that had befallen his household since the amethyst's arrival. After Colonel Ferris's death, the Delhi Purple Sapphire passed to other family members who quickly discovered that the stone's malevolent influence had not died with its original owner. Each successive owner within the Ferris family experienced similar patterns of misfortune, including financial losses, health problems, and family tragedies that seemed to escalate the longer they kept the stone in their possession. The family's attempts to sell the amethyst were repeatedly frustrated by potential buyers who would agree to purchase it, only to withdraw their offers at the last moment, often citing sudden changes in their circumstances or unexplained feelings of unease about the transaction. Eventually, the stone found its way into London's gemstone market, where it was acquired by a dealer who specialised in unusual and rare specimens. However, the dealer's ownership was brief and troubled, as he immediately began experiencing the same pattern of difficulties that had plagued the Ferris family. His other business ventures failed, his health deteriorated, and he found himself desperately trying to rid himself of the amethyst as quickly as possible. The stone changed hands several more times during the 1870s and 1880s, with each owner experiencing similar misfortunes and attempting to pass the curse on to someone else. In 1890, the Delhi Purple Sapphire was purchased by Edward Heron Allen, a distinguished British scientist, writer, and collector who was well known in London's intellectual circles as a friend of Oscar Wilde and a respected authority on various subjects ranging from archaeology to palmistry. Heron Allen was a rational, educated man who approached the purchase of the amethyst from a purely academic perspective, intending to study it as an example of colonial-era gemstone collecting. He was aware of the stone's reputation, but dismissed the curse stories as superstitious nonsense that had no place in serious scholarly investigation. However, his skeptical attitude would not protect him from experiencing the same devastating pattern of misfortune that had destroyed every previous owner. Almost immediately after acquiring the Delhi Purple Sapphire, Heron Allen began experiencing a series of setbacks that matched the descriptions provided by previous owners. His normally successful writing career stalled as publishers rejected manuscripts that would have been eagerly accepted just months earlier. His scientific research projects encountered unexpected obstacles and funding difficulties that had never been problems in his previous work. Most disturbing were the changes in his personal life, as friends and colleagues began avoiding him without explanation, and his social standing in London's intellectual community began to decline for reasons he could not understand. The curse's impact on Heron Allen's household was particularly severe. Family members and servants reported seeing strange shadows moving through the house, hearing unexplained sounds at night, and experiencing sudden drops in temperature in rooms where the amethyst was stored. Several domestic employees quit their positions without notice, citing an overwhelming feeling of dread that they experienced while working in the house. Heron Allen himself began suffering from insomnia and anxiety, often waking in the middle of the night with the sensation that he was being watched by an unseen presence. Convinced that the amethyst was indeed cursed and determined to protect others from its influence, Heron Allen attempted various methods to neutralize or contain the stone's malevolent power. He consulted with religious authorities from multiple faiths, seeking blessing ceremonies and purification rituals that might cleanse the amethyst of its negative energy. When these efforts proved ineffective, he turned to more practical approaches, having the stone set in a ring surrounded by protective symbols and blessed charmers that he hoped would contain its influence. However, none of these measures appeared to diminish the curse's power, and the misfortunes continued to plague his household. Growing increasingly desperate to rid himself of the cursed amethyst, Heron Allen decided to give it away to friends and acquaintances, believing that he might break the curse by freely offering the stone rather than selling it for profit. However, this strategy proved disastrous for the recipients. The first friend who accepted the amethyst as a gift returned it within weeks, reporting that his family had experienced a series of accidents and illnesses that began immediately after the stone entered their home. A second friend who agreed to take possession of the amethyst suffered a complete financial collapse within months, losing his business and family fortune in a series of failed investments and legal disputes that seemed to arise from nowhere. The most tragic case involved a singer friend of Heron Allen's who accepted the Delhi purple sapphire as a gift and incorporated it into her stage costume, believing that the beautiful amethyst would enhance her performances. However, from the moment she began wearing the stone, her voice began to deteriorate in ways that medical professionals could not explain. What had once been a clear, powerful singing voice became weak and unreliable, forcing her to cancel performances and eventually ending her career entirely. The singer's health continued to decline even after she returned the stone to Heron Allen, and she died young under circumstances that her family always attributed to the curse of the amethyst. Realizing that simply giving away the stone would not end its reign of terror, Heron Allen decided to take more drastic measures to contain the curse. In 1904, he commissioned a special locked box made of multiple layers of different materials, including iron, silver, and blessed wood, designed to contain supernatural influences according to various traditional practices. He placed the Delhi purple sapphire inside this container, along with written warnings about its dangerous nature, and sealed it with multiple locks and protective symbols. The box was then placed inside another container, and the entire assembly was surrounded by additional protective charms and amulets that Heron Allen had collected from various religious traditions. However, even these elaborate precautions were not sufficient to completely neutralize the amethyst's influence. Heron Allen continued to experience difficulties in his career and personal life, though they were less severe than during the period when he had direct contact with the stone. He documented his experiences with the cursed amethyst in a detailed journal, recording not only the misfortunes that had befallen him and others, but also his various attempts to understand and contain the supernatural forces associated with the stone. His writings reveal a man who had been transformed from a rational skeptic into someone who fully believed in the reality of the curse, despite his scientific background and education. In 1918, Heron Allen made the decision to donate the sealed Delhi purple sapphire to the Natural History Museum in London, believing that a public institution might be better equipped to handle the dangerous artifact than any private individual. However, he attached strict conditions to the donation, specifying that the stone should not be displayed or handled for at least 33 years, and that it should never be removed from its protective containers without extreme caution. He included a detailed letter warning museum officials about the stone's deadly history and urging them to treat it as an extremely dangerous artifact that should be approached with the utmost care. The letter that Heron Allen wrote to accompany his donation has become one of the most famous documents in the history of cursed objects. In it, he stated that the Delhi purple sapphire was accursed and is stained with the blood and the dishonour of everyone who has ever owned it. He described the stone as having brought misfortune to every person who had possessed it, and warned that it should never be worn by anyone, particularly women, as it seemed to have an especially malevolent effect on female owners. The letter concluded with his fervent hope that, by placing the amethyst in a museum, where it would be contained but not actively owned by any individual, the cycle of tragedy might finally be broken. The Natural History Museum accepted Heron Allen's donation but initially chose not to display the stone, keeping it in storage as requested. However, museum staff members who worked with the collection began reporting unusual incidents similar to those described by previous owners. Several curators and researchers who handled the sealed containers experienced unexplained accidents, health problems, and professional setbacks that seemed to follow the established pattern of the curse. One curator, who spent considerable time cataloguing the Heron Allen collection, suffered a series of personal tragedies, including the death of a family member and significant financial losses, leading him to request reassignment to a different department. When the 33-year restriction period ended in 1951, museum officials faced the decision of whether to put the Delhi purple sapphire on public display. After consulting Heron Allen's warnings and reviewing reports from staff members who had worked with the collection, they decided to exhibit the stone but to keep it in its sealed containers with prominent warning labels describing its history and the experiences of previous owners. The display case was designed to allow visitors to see the amethyst while maintaining the protective barriers that Heron Allen had constructed around it. The museum's documentation of visitor reactions to the Delhi purple sapphire display has provided additional evidence for the stone's continuing influence. Multiple visitors have reported feeling suddenly ill or dizzy when viewing the amethyst, with symptoms disappearing as soon as they moved away from the display case. Some visitors have claimed to see movement or changes in the stone's appearance while looking at it, though photographs consistently show the amethyst in the same position and condition. Security guards assigned to the gallery containing the Delhi purple sapphire have requested transfers more frequently than those working in other areas of the museum, citing an uncomfortable feeling when working near the display. Modern attempts to study the Delhi purple sapphire using scientific methods have yielded mixed results that neither confirm nor disprove the existence of supernatural influences. Geological analysis has confirmed that the stone is indeed an amethyst of the type commonly found in certain regions of India, consistent with its supposed origin at the Temple of Indra. However, researchers have found no unusual properties or compositions that would explain the reported curse effects. Psychological studies of the curse phenomenon suggest that suggestion and expectation may play a role in some reported incidents, but the consistency of experiences across different time periods and cultures makes it difficult to dismiss all reports as purely psychological. The unlucky mummy of the British Museum. In the Egyptian galleries of the British Museum in London sits an ancient wooden coffin lid that has earned one of the most ominous nicknames in the world of archaeology. Museum visitors know it as the unlucky mummy, and for over a century this 3000-year-old artifact has been blamed for deaths, accidents and disasters that have touched everyone from photographers to ship passengers. The most famous legend claims it sank the Titanic. But the truth behind this wooden coffin lid is more complex than the myths that surround it. The artifact itself is not actually a mummy at all. It is a wooden mummy board, also called an inner coffin lid, that would have been placed directly over the wrapped body of an ancient Egyptian. Dating from around 950 to 900 BC during the 22nd dynasty, it shows the painted face and crossed arms of a woman, probably a priestess or high-ranking female. The board is made of wood covered with gesso and painted with bright colours that have somehow survived nearly 3 millennia. Its catalogue number at the British Museum is EA 22542, but almost everyone calls it by its popular name. The coffin lid came to the British Museum in 1889 as a donation from a private collector. The museum's records show it was given by a man named Arthur Wheeler, though some sources say it came through a dealer named Douglas Murray. The exact details of how it was acquired are unclear, which is typical for many Egyptian artefacts that entered European collections during the late 1800s, when archaeological standards were less strict than they are today. Almost immediately after the coffin lid went on display, stories began to circulate about strange incidents affecting people who worked with it or came too close to it. The first documented claim involved a photographer who was hired to take pictures of the artifact for the museum's catalogue. According to the story, the photographer set up his equipment and took several shots of the coffin lid. When he developed the film, the face in the photographs looked different from the painted face on the actual artifact. Instead of the serene expression of the original, the face in the photographs appeared angry and threatening. The photographer became so disturbed by the images that he refused to work with the artifact again. Shortly afterward, he reportedly suffered a series of personal and professional setbacks. His business began to fail, he lost several important clients, and his health declined rapidly. Within 2 years, he was dead. Museum staff and visitors began to whisper that the coffin lid had somehow caused his death. Other incidents followed. A museum guard who worked in the Egyptian galleries claimed that he heard strange sounds coming from the display case at night. He reported hearing what sounded like sobbing or moaning, always coming from the direction of the unlucky mummy. The guard requested to be transferred to a different section of the museum, but before the transfer could be arranged, he suffered a heart attack while on duty. He survived, but he never returned to work at the museum. In 1904, a wealthy businessman named Lord Canterville purchased a reproduction of the coffin lid after seeing the original at the museum. He had the copy made by expert craftsmen and placed it in his London home. Within months of bringing the reproduction into his house, Canterville's wife fell down the stairs and broke her neck. His eldest son was killed in a hunting accident. His daughter ran away from home and was never seen again. Canterville himself lost his fortune in a series of bad investments and died penniless in 1907. The most famous legend about the unlucky mummy involves the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912. According to this story, an American millionaire had purchased the coffin lid from the British Museum and was transporting it to New York aboard the Titanic. The curse of the artifact caused the ship to hit an iceberg and sink, killing over 1,500 people. Some versions of the story claim that the coffin lid was recovered from the wreck and is now hidden in a private collection, still bringing death to anyone who owns it. This Titanic connection made the unlucky mummy famous around the world. Newspapers published dramatic accounts of the cursed artifact that had supposedly doomed the greatest ship ever built. The story was so popular that it appeared in books, magazines, and eventually movies. For decades, most people believed that the British Museum's coffin lid had somehow caused one of the worst maritime disasters in history. But museum records tell a different story. The unlucky mummy never left the British Museum. It was not sold to any American collector, and it was definitely not aboard the Titanic when the ship sank. The museum has detailed documentation showing that the artifact remained in London throughout 1912. The Titanic story is completely false, created by journalists and storytellers who wanted to connect the famous shipwreck to an existing legend about a cursed object. The museum has investigated many of the other stories about the unlucky mummy and found that most of them are also exaggerated or completely made up. The photographer who supposedly died after taking pictures of the coffin lid cannot be identified in museum records. There is no documentation of any guard having a heart attack in the Egyptian galleries. Lord Canterville appears to be a fictional character created for the story. What the museum has found is a pattern of rumour and exaggeration that grew over time. Each telling of the story added new details and made the curse sound more dramatic. People who visited the museum and heard about the curse began to attribute their own minor accidents and bad luck to the artifact. When a visitor slipped on the museum steps or caught a cold after seeing the unlucky mummy, they blamed the curse. These stories were then retold and exaggerated, creating an ever-growing legend. The museum staff has noted some genuine incidents over the years, but they are easily explained by normal causes. In 1934, a cleaning woman fainted while working near the display case. She had been working long hours and had not eaten properly that day. Her fainting had nothing to do with the artifact, but the story quickly spread that the curse had struck again. In 1967, a tourist suffered a mild heart attack while viewing the Egyptian galleries. He was 73 years old and had a history of heart problems, but some people insisted that the unlucky mummy was responsible. During World War II, the artifact was moved to safety along with other valuable museum pieces. It spent several years in storage tunnels beneath London, away from the bombing raids. Museum workers who handled it during this period reported no unusual incidents. When it was returned to display after the war, the stories about its curse resumed immediately. In the 1970s, the museum conducted an informal study of accidents and incidents in different parts of the building. They found that the Egyptian galleries, including the area where the unlucky mummy is displayed, had no higher rate of accidents than any other section of the museum. Visitors were just as likely to trip, faint, or have minor medical emergencies in the Greek galleries or the medieval weapons room as they were near the supposed cursed artifact. Modern museum professionals understand that the legend of the unlucky mummy serves several psychological purposes. It makes an ancient artifact seem more mysterious and interesting. It gives visitors a thrilling sense of danger while they are in a completely safe environment. It connects them to stories about ancient Egypt that they have heard in movies and books. The cursed legend transforms a static museum display into an exciting experience. The museum now presents the artifact with information about both its historical significance and its legendary reputation. Educational materials explain that it is a fine example of 22nd dynasty Egyptian burial art and that the legends about its curse are not supported by evidence. But many visitors still prefer to believe in the more dramatic version of the story. Photography of the unlucky mummy is now unrestricted, and thousands of tourists take pictures of it every year without experiencing any unusual effects. Museum staff handle it regularly for maintenance and research purposes. It has been loaned to other museums for special exhibitions. None of these activities has resulted in the kinds of disasters described in the curse stories. The artifact remains one of the most popular items in the British Museum's Egyptian collection. Visitors seek it out specifically because of its reputation, and many are disappointed to learn that it is just a wooden coffin lid with no supernatural powers. The museum estimates that over 50 million people have seen the unlucky mummy since it went on display in 1889, and the vast majority of them have gone home safely with nothing more than photographs and memories. Pompei's excavator curse. On August 24, 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted with devastating force, burying the Roman city of Pompeii under tons of volcanic ash and pumice. For nearly 1,700 years, the city remained hidden beneath this natural tomb, preserving buildings, artwork, and even the final moments of its inhabitants. When excavations began in the 18th century, Pompeii offered the world an unprecedented window into ancient Roman life. But from the very beginning, those who disturbed the ancient city seemed to pay a price for their intrusion. The first organised excavations at Pompeii began in 1748, under the direction of Spanish engineer Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre, working for King Charles III of Naples. The early excavation methods were crude and destructive. Workers were more interested in finding valuable artifacts and artwork than in preserving the archaeological context. Many of the original excavation records from this period document accidents and deaths among the workers, though these were often attributed to the dangerous working conditions rather than any supernatural cause. The real pattern of incidents began to emerge during the more systematic excavations of the 19th century. In 1860, Giuseppe Fiorelli was appointed director of excavations at Pompeii, and he revolutionized archaeological methods at the site. Fiorelli divided the city into regions and blocks, creating the numbering system still used today. More importantly, he developed the technique of making plaster casts of the victims by pouring liquid plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies in the hardened ash. Fiorelli's innovations made the excavation more scientific, but they also seemed to increase the number of unusual incidents affecting the excavation teams. The first documented case involved the creation of the famous plaster casts. In 1863, when Fiorelli's team made their first successful cast of a Pompeii victim, 3 workers on the project became seriously ill within days of the casting. One worker, a man named Antonio Scognamiglio, developed severe respiratory problems and died 2 weeks later. The local doctor who examined him could find no medical explanation for his sudden decline. The plaster casting process itself proved dangerous in ways that went beyond normal workplace hazards. Workers reported feeling dizzy and nauseous when working near the casts, especially when new ones were being made. Some experienced vivid nightmares about the ancient city and its victims. In 1865, 2 workers refused to continue working on the casts, after both had the same recurring dream about being trapped in volcanic ash. As excavations expanded under Fiorelli's direction, the accidents multiplied. Between 1860 and 1875, at least 12 workers died in incidents that could not be explained by normal construction accidents. Some were crushed by falling stones, but the stones fell from walls that had been stable for centuries. Others suffered from mysterious illnesses that began after they uncovered particularly well-preserved areas of the city. The most documented case occurred in 1864 when excavators uncovered the Villa of Papyri, a luxurious house containing an ancient library. The team working in this area experienced an unusual number of accidents. Within 1 month, 5 workers were injured when scaffolding collapsed without apparent cause. 2 workers developed severe infections from minor cuts that should have healed normally. The site foreman, Paolo Martucci, began experiencing what he described as voices from the stones and had to be removed from the excavation. Giuseppe Fiorelli himself was not immune to the pattern of misfortune. Despite his scientific approach to the excavation, he suffered a series of personal tragedies during his time at Pompei. His wife died unexpectedly in 1867, just 7 years after he began directing the excavations. 2 of his 3 children died young, one from an accident and another from a sudden illness. Fiorelli's own health declined rapidly during his final years at Pompei, and he died in 1896 at the age of 72, his body weakened by what doctors described as premature aging. The accidents were not limited to the Italian excavation teams. Foreign archaeologists and wealthy tourists who sponsored excavations also seemed to encounter unusual misfortune. Lord Hamilton, a British nobleman who funded excavations in the 1870s, lost his fortune in bad investments shortly after sponsoring the uncovering of the House of the Faun. The German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, famous for discovering Troy, visited Pompeii in 1874 and contracted a severe illness that nearly killed him. He later wrote that he felt oppressed by the weight of ancient sorrows during his time at the site. The discovery of curse tablets at Pompeii added another dimension to the belief that the site was protected by supernatural forces. These small lead tablets, inscribed with Latin curses, were found in various locations throughout the city. The tablets typically called upon the gods to punish thieves, enemies, or anyone who disturbed sacred spaces. Some tablets specifically cursed those who would disturb the sleep of the dead or steal from the buried city. One particularly ominous curse tablet was found in 1881 near the Temple of Jupiter. The inscription, roughly translated, read, "May the gods strike down with disease and death any who remove the stones of this sacred place, and may their families know the suffering of those who died in fire and ash." The worker who found this tablet, Francesco Nuzzo, died in a construction accident 3 days later when a wall collapsed during routine excavation work. Modern excavations at Pompeii have continued to document unusual incidents, though they are now better recorded and studied. Between 1980 and 2010, statistical analysis showed that archaeological teams working at Pompeii had an accident rate 40% higher than teams working at other Italian archaeological sites. Respiratory problems were particularly common, affecting both Italian and international researchers. The environmental hazards at Pompeii provide some rational explanations for health problems among excavators. The volcanic soil contains high levels of crystalline silica, which can cause lung disease when inhaled over long periods. Pockets of toxic gases, including carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, can accumulate in underground chambers and pose serious health risks. The ancient Roman practice of using lead pipes and lead-based paints has left residual contamination in some areas of the city. However, some incidents cannot be easily explained by environmental factors. In 1995, a team of American archaeologists working in the House of the Vetier reported electronic equipment malfunctioning repeatedly in one specific room. Cameras would not work properly, recording equipment produced strange sounds, and computers crashed without explanation. When the team moved their equipment to other parts of the house, everything functioned normally. The psychological effects of working at Pompeii have been documented by several researchers. The site's combination of beauty and tragedy creates an emotionally intense environment. Workers report feeling watched, hearing voices, and experiencing dreams about the ancient inhabitants. Some archaeologists have described feeling the presence of the victims while working near the plaster casts, particularly in areas where multiple bodies were found together. In 2003, Dr. Sarah Martinez, an American archaeologist, conducted a formal study of health and safety incidents at Pompeii compared to other archaeological sites. Her research showed that workers at Pompeii were more likely to report anxiety, depression, and sleep disturbances than workers at other Roman sites. They were also more likely to leave their positions before completing their contracted work periods. The discovery of intact human remains continues to affect excavation teams. In 2018, archaeologists uncovered the skeletal remains of a man who appeared to have been fleeing the eruption. The team working on this discovery experienced what their supervisor described as an unusual series of minor accidents and equipment failures during the 2 weeks following the find. 3 team members requested transfers to other projects. Recent technological advances have allowed researchers to study the plaster casts more thoroughly. CT scans and DNA analysis have revealed new information about the victims, but these studies have also been marked by technical difficulties and equipment malfunctions that seem to occur more frequently at Pompei than at other research sites. The tourism industry at Pompei has also documented unusual patterns. Tour guides report higher rates of visitors fainting, becoming ill, or having panic attacks compared to other historical sites. Some visitors claim to feel overwhelmed by sadness or fear in certain areas of the city, particularly near the Garden of the Fugitives where 13 victims were found huddled together. Modern excavation directors at Pompei acknowledge the site's reputation while maintaining scientific objectivity. Dr. Massimo Osanna, who directed the site from 2014 to 2020, implemented new safety protocols that included both modern occupational health measures and what he diplomatically called cultural sensitivity training for workers. This training included information about the site's history and the psychological effects of working with human remains. The question of whether Pompei is actually cursed or simply presents unusual challenges due to its history and environmental conditions remains open to interpretation. The site combines several factors that could contribute to accidents and health problems: toxic soil conditions, unstable ancient structures, high emotional intensity, and the psychological pressure of working with evidence of mass tragedy. The bone churches. In the small town of Kutna Hora, Czech Republic, stands one of the most unsettling churches in the world. The Sedlec Ossuary, known locally as the Bone Church, contains the skeletal remains of over 40,000 people arranged in elaborate decorative patterns. Chandeliers made of human bones hang from the ceiling, while pyramids of skulls tower in the corners. The bones belong to victims of the Black Death and the Hussite Wars from the 14th and 15th centuries. What makes this place particularly significant for our investigation is not just its macabre decorations, but the documented pattern of accidents and unexplained incidents that have occurred whenever anyone has attempted to disturb or renovate these sacred remains. The story begins in 1278 when Henry, the abbot of Sedlec Monastery, returned from the Holy Land carrying a handful of soil from Golgotha, where Christ was crucified. He scattered this sacred earth over the abbey cemetery, instantly making it one of the most desirable burial places in Central Europe. Word spread quickly, and people travelled from across the region to be buried in this blessed ground. Then came the plague years of the 1300s, followed by the devastating Hussite Wars in the early 1400s. The small cemetery became overwhelmed with bodies, forcing the monks to exhume older remains to make room for new burials. By 1511, the monastery had hired a half-blind monk named František Rint to organise the massive collection of bones. Instead of simply reburying them, Rint created something unprecedented. He arranged the skeletal remains into artistic displays throughout the chapel. 4 enormous pyramids of bones rose from the floor, while garlands of skulls decorated the walls. The pièce de résistance was a massive chandelier containing at least one of every bone in the human body, hanging in the centre of the chapel. Rint's work created a meditation on mortality that attracted pilgrimage visitors for centuries. The first documented incident occurred in 1870 when the Schwarzenberg family, who had purchased the chapel, hired a woodcarver named František Rint, descendant of the original monk, to restore and reorganise the bone arrangements. During the renovation work, 3 of Rint's assistants died in separate accidents within 6 months. The first fell from scaffolding while working on the bone chandelier, breaking his neck in an almost identical position to the skulls he had been arranging. The second assistant developed a mysterious respiratory illness that doctors could not diagnose or treat. He slowly suffocated, describing to witnesses that he felt as though bone dust was filling his lungs, even though medical examinations found no foreign substances. The third assistant simply disappeared during a night shift. His body was found 3 days later in the crypt beneath the chapel, positioned as if he had been trying to crawl out, though there was no obvious cause of death. František Rint himself documented these incidents in his personal journal, which was discovered in the 1960s during construction work at a nearby building. In his entries, Rindt described feeling watched while working alone in the chapel and hearing whispered conversations in languages he did not recognise. He wrote about tools being moved overnight and finding footprints in areas where no one had been working. Most disturbing were his accounts of the bone arrangements changing position. He would carefully document the placement of specific skulls or femurs, only to find them in different positions the next morning. Rindt completed his work but left Kutna immediately afterward, never returning to see his finished creation. The pattern continued into the 20th century. In 1924, a photographer named Josef Sudek arrived to document the ossuary for a book about Czech architectural wonders. Sudek was already an established photographer who had lost his right arm in World War I, but had adapted his techniques to continue his work. On his third day photographing the bone church, Sudek's camera equipment repeatedly malfunctioned in ways he had never experienced. His glass plates cracked without cause, his tripod collapsed despite being properly secured, and his light readings became inconsistent. More troubling were the photographs themselves. When developed, many showed shadowy figures standing among the bone displays, figures that Sudek insisted were not present when he took the pictures. Several images showed the bone arrangements in configurations that differed from their actual positions. Sudek abandoned the project after his assistant Karel Novak developed severe vertigo and anxiety attacks that only occurred inside the chapel. During World War II, the ossuary faced its greatest threat when Nazi officials decided to use the chapel as a storage facility for looted art and artifacts. German soldiers were ordered to remove sections of the bone displays to make room for crates. According to Wehrmacht records discovered after the war, the work detail assigned to the chapel experienced an unusual number of accidents and disciplinary problems. Within 2 weeks, 7 soldiers had been hospitalised with various injuries ranging from severe cuts to unexplained seizures. The commanding officer, Major Heinrich Weber, documented these incidents in reports to his superiors, describing the soldiers as increasingly reluctant to enter the chapel and exhibiting signs of extreme stress and paranoia. The most significant incident occurred when Weber himself decided to personally oversee the removal of the bone chandelier. As soldiers worked to lower the massive decoration, the supporting chains suddenly snapped, despite being rated to hold 3 times the chandelier's weight. The falling bones struck Weber in the head and chest, causing serious injuries that required his evacuation to a military hospital in Prague. His replacement, Captain Franz Müller, decided to abandon the storage plan after consulting with local residents who warned him about the chapel's reputation. Müller's decision may have saved lives, as his report noted that several soldiers had begun experiencing nightmares and were requesting transfers to other units. The post-war era brought new challenges as the communist government took control of Czechoslovakia. In 1952, officials decided to convert the ossuary into a museum of medieval history, requiring significant modifications to the interior structure. The renovation team, led by state architect Václav Czerny, began work with confidence and modern equipment. However, the project quickly encountered problems that paralleled earlier incidents. Workers reported tools disappearing and reappearing in impossible locations. Electrical equipment failed repeatedly, despite being newly installed and regularly maintained. Several workers developed respiratory problems similar to those experienced by Rindt's assistant in 1870, though medical examinations found no cause. The most documented incident from this period involved construction foreman Milan Dvorak, who was supervising the installation of new lighting systems in 1953. Dvorak was working alone in the chapel one evening when the power suddenly failed, plunging the space into complete darkness. According to his written report filed with both his construction company and local police, he heard distinct voices speaking in what sounded like medieval Czech, a language form he'd studied in school but rarely heard spoken. The voices seemed to be coming from different locations throughout the chapel, as if multiple conversations were occurring simultaneously among the bone displays. When Dvorak used his flashlight to navigate toward the exit, he discovered that the bone arrangements had been disturbed. Several skulls from the chandeliers were now arranged on the floor, in patterns that resembled ancient Celtic symbols, something that should have been impossible given that the skulls were secured with wire. More disturbing was his claim that some of the skulls had been turned to face the entrance, as if watching anyone who entered or left. Dvorak completed his shift but refused to work alone in the chapel again. The project was completed using only daytime shifts with multiple workers present at all times. Modern incidents have been less dramatic but equally puzzling. In 1994, during preparations for increased tourism following the Velvet Revolution, maintenance workers discovered that several bone arrangements had shifted from their documented positions. Photographic records kept by the museum showed clear differences in the placement of specific elements, yet security cameras had recorded no human activity in the areas where changes occurred. The museum director at the time, Dr. Yanis Svobodova, commissioned a structural analysis to determine if settling or vibration could explain the movements. Engineers found the building to be sound and stable, with no evidence of environmental factors that could cause such specific displacements. More recently, in 2008, the ossuary underwent its most comprehensive restoration in centuries. The project involved international experts and utilised advanced conservation techniques to preserve the bone arrangements for future generations. Despite modern project management and safety protocols, the restoration team experienced a pattern of minor but consistent problems. Equipment malfunctions occurred at rates significantly higher than on comparable projects. Several team members reported feeling dizzy or nauseous while working in specific areas of the chapel, symptoms that disappeared immediately upon leaving the building. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a bone conservation specialist from Oxford University who led part of the restoration, documented these incidents in her project reports, noting that while none were individually significant, the cumulative pattern was unusual enough to warrant mention. The restoration also revealed new information about the ossuary's construction. Advanced imaging techniques showed that the bone arrangements were far more complex than previously understood, with hidden structural elements and symbolic patterns that suggested the original designer had extensive knowledge of both engineering and medieval religious symbolism. Some arrangements incorporated acoustic properties that created subtle resonances when air moved through the chapel, potentially explaining reports of whispered voices. However, these discoveries also raised new questions about how a half-blind monk in the 16th century could have created such sophisticated designs without modern tools or architectural training. Scientific analysis of the reported incidents shows interesting patterns that resist simple explanation. Statistical analysis of accident rates during various renovation projects at the ossuary consistently shows higher than average incidents compared to similar historical sites. Medical records from workers who experienced health problems while working in the chapel show no common factors that would explain their symptoms, yet the symptoms consistently resolved once they stopped working in the building. Environmental testing has found no toxic substances, dangerous gases, or structural hazards that could account for the reported effects. What makes the Sedlec Ossuary particularly compelling in the investigation of cursed locations is the consistency of reported incidents across different time periods, cultures, and belief systems. Whether dealing with medieval monks, Nazi soldiers, communist officials, or modern restoration experts, the pattern of unusual accidents and unexplained phenomena remains remarkably similar. The documented evidence spans over 400 years and includes testimony from individuals who had no knowledge of previous incidents, suggesting that if there is a psychological component to these experiences, it operates independently of suggestion or expectation. The Hexham Heads. On a cold February morning in 1971, 11-year-old Colin Robson was helping his mother with garden work at their home on Reed Avenue in Hexham, a market town in Northumberland, England. As Colin dug near the back fence, his spade struck something hard buried about 2 feet underground. What he unearthed would become one of Britain's most enduring archaeological mysteries and spark reports of supernatural encounters that continue to this day. The object was a carved stone head, roughly the size of a tennis ball, with crude but distinctive features including hollow eye sockets and a grimacing expression. Excited by his discovery, Colin called his younger brother Leslie to help search the area. Within minutes, they had found a second head, similar in size but with different facial features. The Robson family initially treated the heads as curious garden ornaments, placing them on their mantelpiece as conversation pieces. However, within days of the discovery, strange incidents began occurring in the household. The family reported objects moving on their own, unexplained cold spots throughout the house, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Most disturbing were the sounds that seemed to come from the heads themselves, a low humming or vibrating noise that multiple family members heard but could never pinpoint to any obvious source. Colin's mother, Nancy Robson, documented these incidents in a diary she kept during the weeks following the discovery, describing how the family dog refused to enter the room where the heads were displayed and how houseplants in the same room began dying despite receiving proper care. Word of the unusual find spread through the local community, eventually reaching Dr. Frank Salkeld, a local historian and antiquarian who examined the heads and suggested they might be of archaeological significance. Salkeld arranged for the heads to be studied by Dr. Anne Ross, a respected archaeologist and Celtic scholar at Southampton University, who specialised in ancient British religious artefacts. Dr. Ross was particularly interested because the heads appeared to match descriptions of Celtic cult objects used in pre-Christian religious practices throughout Britain and Ireland. She agreed to take possession of the heads for detailed analysis at her home laboratory. Dr. Ross brought the Hexham Heads to her Victorian terraced house in Southampton in early 1972, where she planned to conduct photographic documentation and comparative analysis with similar artefacts in her collection. However, within hours of the heads arriving at her home, Ross and her family began experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. The first incident occurred on the very night the heads arrived. Ross had placed them on a table in her study for examination the following morning, but was awakened around 2 a.m. by the sound of her teenage daughter screaming from the room below. When Ross rushed downstairs, she found her daughter in a state of terror, claiming to have seen a creature with the body of a man but the head of a wolf, standing at the bottom of the staircase. The daughter, who had been studying late in the living room, described the creature as approximately 6 feet tall with dark fur covering its face and hands, wearing what appeared to be modern clothing. Most unsettling was her account of the creature's eyes, which she said glowed with an amber light and seemed to display human intelligence despite the animal features. The creature had stood motionless for several seconds, staring directly at her, before turning and walking toward the kitchen, where it seemed to vanish. Dr. Ross found no evidence of forced entry, and a thorough search of the house revealed no intruder, yet her daughter insisted the encounter was absolutely real. This incident marked the beginning of several weeks of escalating paranormal activity in the Ross household. Family members reported cold spots that moved through rooms, the sound of heavy footsteps on the upper floors when no one was there, and the persistent feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. Most disturbing were the recurring sightings of the wolf-headed creature, which appeared to different family members on multiple occasions. Dr. Ross herself encountered the entity twice, once glimpsing it through a window looking into her study where the heads were stored, and again seeing it in her peripheral vision, while working late in her office. Each time, the creature appeared and disappeared without making any sound or leaving physical evidence of its presence. The psychological impact on the Ross family was severe enough that Dr. Ross decided to remove the heads from her home, despite her professional interest in completing the analysis. She contacted colleagues at Newcastle University, arranging for the heads to be studied there under controlled conditions. However, the transfer did not end the strange occurrences. Dr. Don Robbins, a chemist and archaeological researcher who received the heads at Newcastle, reported similar phenomena beginning almost immediately after they arrived at the university. Laboratory equipment malfunctioned in the presence of the heads, with electronic instruments giving inconsistent readings and photographic equipment producing inexplicably blurred or distorted images. More significantly, Dr. Robbins documented several incidents involving research assistants and graduate students who worked with the heads. 3 different individuals reported feeling suddenly dizzy or nauseous when handling the artifacts, with symptoms disappearing immediately once they stopped touching the objects. 2 graduate students independently reported having vivid nightmares featuring wolf-like creatures after spending time examining the heads, despite having no knowledge of the Ross family's experiences. One student, working alone in the laboratory late one evening, reported hearing growling sounds that seemed to emanate from the storage cabinet where the heads were kept, though no source for the sounds could be identified. The most dramatic incident at Newcastle occurred when Dr. Robbins was conducting spectrographic analysis of the stone material. During the procedure, the laboratory's security system triggered multiple alarms simultaneously, indicating breach detections at various points throughout the building. When security guards responded, they found no evidence of intrusion, but several reported hearing what sounded like large animals moving through the corridors. One guard, stationed at the main entrance, claimed to have seen a large, dog-like shape moving across the courtyard outside, but a search of the grounds revealed no animals and no tracks in the snow that had fallen that evening. The scientific analysis of the heads themselves yielded puzzling results that added to the mystery rather than resolving it. Geological testing indicated the stone was a type of sandstone consistent with local quarries, suggesting the heads were carved from material available in the Hexham area. However, the carving techniques and tool marks were inconsistent with known prehistoric methods, leading some researchers to question whether the heads were genuinely ancient artifacts or more recent creations. Dr. Robin's chemical analysis detected trace amounts of various organic compounds embedded in the stone, but these results were inconclusive and could not definitively date the objects or determine their original purpose. The investigation took an unexpected turn in 1972 when a local Hexham resident named Desmond Craigie came forward claiming to have created the heads himself. Craigie, who had lived in the area for several decades, stated that he'd carved the heads from concrete in his backyard sometime in the 1960s as decorative garden ornaments. He provided detailed descriptions of his carving process and claimed to have buried the heads in his garden after growing tired of them. However, Craigie's account raised more questions than it answered. His description of the carving process did not match the tool marks observed on the heads, and geological analysis had clearly identified the material as natural sandstone, not concrete as Craigie claimed. Furthermore, Craigie could not explain why his supposedly modern concrete creations had caused such dramatic paranormal phenomena, nor could he provide any evidence to support his claims. No photographs, sketches, or witnesses to his carving process could be located. An examination of his property revealed no workshop area or tools consistent with stone carving. Some investigators suspected that Craigie's confession was an attempt to end the publicity surrounding the heads, which had attracted unwanted attention to the quiet Hexham neighbourhood. The mystery deepened when attempts were made to trace the chain of ownership of the property where the heads were discovered. Historical records showed that the Robson family's house had been built in the 1960s on land that had previously been farmland for several centuries. Archaeological surveys of the immediate area revealed no evidence of prehistoric settlement or burial sites that might explain the presence of carved stone heads. However, local historians noted that the region had been inhabited continuously since Roman times, and that numerous ancient sites existed within a few miles of the discovery location. Additional witnesses came forward with their own accounts of unusual encounters that seemed connected to the heads. Betty Gibson, an elderly resident who lived several streets away from the Robson family, reported seeing a creature she described as a were-sheep, a bipedal animal with sheep-like features but human-like posture, in her garden on multiple occasions during the weeks following the head's discovery. Gibson's account was particularly credible because she had no knowledge of the other supernatural reports and described her encounters to neighbours before the stories became public knowledge. Her descriptions matched the general pattern of human-animal hybrid sightings reported by others who had encountered the heads. The heads changed hands several more times over the following years, with each new owner reporting similar patterns of strange occurrences. A private collector who acquired them in 1973 returned them to the university after his family experienced unexplained illnesses and recurring nightmares. A museum in Scotland agreed to display them, but returned them after several visitors reported feeling unwell in the exhibition room and staff members complained of unusual sounds and cold spots. By the mid-1970s, the heads had developed such a reputation that institutions were reluctant to house them permanently. The final documented location of the Hexham Heads was with Dr. Ross, who had continued her research despite the disturbing experiences at her home. However, sometime in the late 1970s, the heads disappeared from her collection under circumstances that remain unclear. Dr. Ross herself provided conflicting accounts of what happened to them, at various times claiming they had been returned to the Robson family, donated to a museum, or lost during a house move. Attempts to trace their current whereabouts have been unsuccessful, leading to speculation that they were deliberately hidden or destroyed to prevent further incidents. The disappearance of the heads has not ended the mystery surrounding them. Researchers continue to investigate the case, and new witnesses occasionally come forward with additional information. In 2017, Colin Robson, now in his late 50s, was interviewed about his childhood discovery and confirmed many details of the original story, while adding that he had always felt uneasy about the heads and was not surprised by the supernatural reports. He mentioned that his family had experienced occasional strange incidents in their home for years after giving away the heads, though these had gradually diminished over time. Modern attempts to recreate the heads based on photographs and witness descriptions have produced objects that closely match the originals in appearance, but have not generated any supernatural phenomena, supporting the theory that something unique about the original heads was responsible for the reported incidents. Geological analysis of stone samples from the suspected carving location has failed to find any material that exactly matches the composition of the original heads, adding another layer to the mystery of their true origin. The scientific community remains divided on the Hexham Heads case, with some researchers dismissing the supernatural reports as mass hysteria or suggestion, while others argue that the consistency of witness accounts and the credibility of the observers suggest something genuinely anomalous occurred. The case has become a classic example of how archaeological discoveries can generate phenomena that challenge conventional understanding of the relationship between physical objects and human experience, leaving investigators to wonder whether some artifacts carry influences that extend beyond their material composition into realms that science has yet to fully comprehend. The tombs have been sealed, the artifacts locked away in museum vaults, and the archaeologists have moved on to safer discoveries. Yet the stories endure, whispered in university corridors and shared around campfires at dig sites, because they remind us that some mysteries are meant to remain buried. As another expedition prepares to venture into forgotten ruins, and another scholar reaches for an ancient relic, one truth remains constant. Somewhere beneath the sand and stone, in chambers that have known only darkness for millennia, the dead continue their eternal vigil over secrets that were never meant for the living. The earth remembers every curse and releases none.